liberty, and justice for all. Beck, will you lead us in roll call, please?
Yes, Madam Chair. Councilmember Burgess. Here. Councilmember Damrow.
Here.
Councilmember Lee.
Here.
Councilmember Smith.
Here.
Councilmember Zingale.
Here.
Chair Madueño.
Here. We will now move on to item 3, and this is public comment. This item is for the public to comment on any topic not on today's council agenda. Any comments and items on the agenda will be taken during that time. Beck, is there any public comment?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay, we will move on then to item number 4, which is the consent calendar, and that consists of 3 items: adoption of the February 23rd, 23 meeting summary, contract amendment with AECOM to extend the performance period and add budget to master contract number 8932, and item C, which is the contract amendment with Stantec Consulting Services to extend their contract performance period, which is contract number 1461. Is there any questions, comments on the consent calendar? If not, I will entertain a motion.
Move to approve the consent calendar.
And I'll second that.
Motion by Councilmember Smith and a second by Councilmember Burgess. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Burgess.
Yes.
Councilmember Damrow.
I agree.
Councilmember Lee.
Aye.
Councilmember Smith.
Aye.
Councilmember Zingale.
Aye.
Chair Madueño.
Aye. Moving on to item 5, and that is the chair's report. Just a few items that I wanted to highlight in my report today. Still continuing on our meet and greets, legislative meet and greets, and just in the last 3 weeks, I've had the great fortune and opportunity to meet with Assembly members Via Pudua and Assembly member Alanis, who actually happened to be from my neck of the woods. Assembly member Via Pudua was incredibly engaged in terms of the Delta and some of the items that he wants to explore, and actually had a lot of questions from his chief of staff. Assembly member Alanis is brand new to the state assembly, and actually he's literally from my hometown of Riverbank, California. And so it was great to visit with him, check in. Again, some questions that he had. And we, of course, had our great staff member, Brandon, who is following up a very short and curt meeting with Senator Becker. You can see that he has not a lot of engagement with the Delta, but we're hoping to, again, extend that olive branch to him and hopefully have him get more engaged. Met with Sacramento County Supervisor Hume, and who sends his regards to you, Councilmember Burgess. And then earlier this week, myself and our executive officer had the pleasure of meeting with Miguel Luna, who is one of the board members for the Metropolitan Water District. Again, the opportunity to engage, to be able to highlight some of the critical issues affecting the Delta and our work in the Delta. So again, good stuff there, and I'm sure Brandon will give you more of a recap. Attended the Women in Legislature conference. Again, I thought their comments were incredibly heartfelt, but I think the core of that discussion, if you will, and all came back to equity, which seems to be kind of the norm as I traveled throughout the state. Had the pleasure of attending the legislative reception with the California Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Was approached by a couple of members who also had some questions with regard to levies and our recent Delta levy investment strategy. So we'll be doing some follow-up there. And then next Monday and Tuesday, I will actually be joining the Independent Science Board at their meeting on Monday, and then taking the tour with them on Tuesday. And on Monday, actually, I don't know if it's on a Monday, but it's on March 30th. I will be attending Secretary Ross. She will be hosting the Future of Agriculture Summit in Fresno. So I'll be attending that and then driving up to Sacramento for an evening reception with the California. It's actually called the Future of California Restoration. So super excited to hear more about that. And now I will actually turn it over to Amanda Bull, who is our Special Assistant for Planning and Science, who can give you a little bit more on what's happening with DPIC and some of the changes and upcoming meetings that we have scheduled. So Amanda, good morning.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Dueño, and good morning, council members. With me today virtually is the council's executive fellow, Viet Long Nguyen. And together we are going to build off of last month's work plan presentation to provide you just a bit more detail about DPIC's 2023 activities. And since it has been a long time since I've presented and there are many new faces in the council, I'd like to start with just a little bit of a refresher about what DPIC is and who makes up DPIC. So next slide, please. There we go, perfect, okay. So DPIC, like the council, was created by the Delta Reform Act. And while the Delta Reform Act provides much detail on the how, when, why, and where of the council, for DPIC, the act simply states that the council shall establish and oversee a committee of agencies responsible for implementing the Delta Plan. Each agency shall coordinate its actions pursuant to the Delta Plan with the council and the other relevant agencies, and that's all. So with this direction, DPIC first met in 2014 and has since met 2 to 3 times per year and sponsored multiple convenings, including the Science Enterprise Workshop in 2016 and the Science Funding and Governance Initiative, which included a series of brown bags and a workshop in 2020. DPIC is comprised of 19 state and federal agencies, and you can see the logos on the screen there and in the presentation. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned during the February council meeting, DPIC's 2023 activities will focus on 3 primary areas: relationship building, making progress on the Delta Plan's restoration goals, and then issuing the 4th annual Delta Crosscut Budget Report. In many ways, this is a continuation of work we've done in the past, but with an updated focus around being more intentional in the way that we engage with our partners, both the DPIC agencies as well as other interested parties living and working in the Delta and the greater Delta watershed. Next slide, please. So last fall, as Chairman Dueño and I paused the DPIC meetings and spoke with some of our DPIC partners, we heard time and time again that if DPIC didn't exist, we'd be trying to create it. And so considering this and also acknowledging that DPIC doesn't have any regulatory authority, we really asked ourselves, how can DPIC provide the most service to the issues facing the Delta? And we concluded that it's really in bringing people and agencies together and interested parties together in the Delta to talk about some of these bigger issues. So in the spirit of trying to capture this, we thought of gatherings, using the time within DPIC meetings to really focus on dialogue, connection, and relationship building. DPIC will meet twice in 2023. Each gathering will be publicly noticed and will include a site visit. The first meeting is April 24th, so just a little bit over a month from now, and we'll focus on restoration. This gathering will start at the Dutch Slough Restoration Site, which is just very close to where we are right now, across the water, hosted by the Department of Water Resources. And then we're going to move to the Big Break Regional Shoreline for lunch and the meeting, which will include updates on the DPIC Restoration Subcommittee and dialogue around how the DPIC leaders can further engage in these efforts. And now I'm going to ask Viet Long to discuss the DPIC Restoration Subcommittee for you. Next slide, please. And is Viet Long on?
Yeah, good morning, council members. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. So the Restoration Subcommittee was formed in 2022 in response to a recommendation in the Delta Plan Chapter 4 amendment. Specifically, it says to improve institutional coordination to support the implementation of ecosystem protection, restoration, and enhancement. The purpose of this subcommittee is to identify and implement strategies for reducing barriers to landscape scale restoration and to increase estuary-wide coordination. The Delta Plan has a goal of restoring 60 to 80,000 acres by 2050, which is consistent with statewide goals for biodiversity like the California Natural Resource Agency's 30 by 30 initiative. To date, the subcommittee has met 4 times and has convened task forces to draft the subcommittee's work plan and to convene the first Delta Restoration Forum, which was held on February 8th. I also want to note that the subcommittee is being staffed by senior environmental scientist Dr. Dylan Chappell, who couldn't be here today, and the Delta Conservancy's senior environmental scientist Dr. Rachel Wigington. Next slide, please. So the subcommittee focused much of its energy in 2022 on collaboratively developing its first work plan, which consists of 4 goals. Number 1 is to provide forums for meaningful community participation in Delta restoration efforts. Number 2 is to increase interagency collaboration to streamline restoration implementation. Third is to identify opportunities in restoration planning and long-term management efforts. And the 4th goal is to increase transparency and coordination around existing, new, and needed restoration funding. These 4 goals are supported by 14 objectives and a total of 28 action items. Next slide, please. So one of the first activities that the subcommittee decided to focus on was the convening of the first Delta Restoration Forum. It was held on February 8th from 3 to 6 p.m. And the goals of this forum were to provide an overview of the amendments to Chapter 4 of the Delta Plan, to discuss and provide input on opportunities for implementing future restoration in the Delta and Sassoon Marsh, and to create opportunities for attendees to build cross-sector relationships and to share information on ecological restoration in the Delta. And most importantly, we wanted to gather feedback to inform the format and content of future restoration forum meetings. A big part of the forum was when forum participants participated in breakout groups and discussed the question of how future ecological restoration can best be implemented to support flourishing Delta ecosystems and human communities. Next slide, please. So a total of 146 people attended our forum. 49 people were in person at the Delta Conservancy's office, and 97 people participated virtually. From these breakout groups and conversations, the team has collected over 40 pages of notes and comments, and we are in the process of analyzing them. At this point, some key takeaways are starting to emerge, and I want to share some of them here. The first takeaway is that outreach, engagement, and public education are key. Improved outreach to groups such as farmers, landowners, reclamation districts, and tribes should be an area of focus moving forward. Additionally, there should be more engagement among agencies to avoid conflict among different regulations and requirements. Second challenge, which isn't surprising, it would be that funding is limited and hard to access. There are challenges in knowing what funding is available and how to apply for it. And mentioned are opportunities to leverage federal funding and to explore ecotourism as a funding source. One thing we heard a lot was that recreational and public access opportunities should be considered when planning for a restoration. The fourth takeaway is that there needs to be a balance between long-term planning and near-term restoration goals. Considering that ecosystems evolve over long time periods, it is challenging to plan and sustain restoration efforts. A fifth takeaway is to use multi-benefit projects to both meet restoration goals and mitigate risks from flooding and subsidence. And subsidence was also mentioned as a challenge, but also subsidence reversal projects present an opportunity to potentially store carbon and to earn revenue from the carbon market. Perhaps the most important thing we heard from participants is that they found the forum valuable and wanted more time to continue the conversations that they were having. One attendee said that, quote, "We need a regular forum to be able to collaborate and to share our ideas, challenges, and opportunities. With this in mind, we will continue to review and analyze the received comments, and we hope to share soon on future plans and events to build on this first restoration forum." And now I'll hand it back to Amanda to provide an overview of the Delta Crosscut budget report. Next slide, please.
Great, thanks, Viet Long. So again, the third area or priority for DPIC really is the continuation of the Delta Crosscut budget reporting process. This annual reporting of Delta Science expenditures implements a process for collecting data that encompasses all of the Delta Science enterprise and includes contributions from many DPIC agencies. Since 2018, the Delta Science Funding and Governance Initiative, which I referenced earlier, or since that effort took place, the DPIC has been working to examine science funding within the Delta Science enterprise with the aim of improving efficiency by implementing common accounting and reporting protocols across funding agencies. We have collected this data for 3 fiscal years, and each report is available on the Council's website. And as we collect more years of data, the Delta Crosscut budget report will help decision makers prioritize future science funding and help us to look forward by identifying where there might be gaps in future funding needs. So during the second year of our data collection for fiscal year 2019 and 2020, we also added the collection of restoration funding data, which is presented separately from the science data. This annual report also identifies areas for improvement in the collection and presentation of the science and restoration data so that we can adaptively manage the collecting and the reporting of this important information. So while most DPIC agencies do contribute to the report, our partner in developing these reports is the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. We work very closely with their staff to collect and analyze this information. And I must give a huge thanks to Senior Environmental Scientist Edmund Yu, who has been part of this project since its inception and really gives and provides very important quality assurance on the data. Next slide, please. And so I encourage you all to look at the reports, as I mentioned, that are online, but I do want to give you a little snapshot of what you can find. The reports collect science and restoration data, self-reported by DPIC agencies using a standardized template. The figure, so the first figure, the figures that you see up there, the first figure on the left shows science expenditures by agency, and the figure on the right, science expenditures by project category. More than half of the system funding came from state agencies during fiscal year 2020, 2021. And again, these figures are for the most recent year collected. And then almost half of that funding was used for core monitoring activities, which is defined as monitoring that provides information on a seasonal and daily basis to perform or inform specific decisions on operations for water supply and fish species status. And the core monitoring is conducted almost entirely to fulfill requirements for regulatory compliance. Next slide, please. And then this last graph I want to show you, again, from our most recent report for 2020-2021, with now 3 years of funding data collected, we have begun to do some comparisons by year and by expenditure. And so this figure, or these figures, show changes over the 3 years that we've been collecting the data. And so this is still not a lot of data to work with. Can't make a lot of conclusions here, but we're excited to continue to collect this information in partnership with our DPIC agencies for years to come. So, and we do know that we've received really positive feedback from other agencies and from other collaborative venues, such as the Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program, who look at these reports on an annual basis and use it to help plan their activities as well. Next slide, please. And so with that, I'll conclude the presentation. And I do want to invite you all to join us April 24th at DPIC at Dutch Slough, and then a big break. It'll be a good day to kind of explore more of Councilmember Burgess's district, and just a nice way to kind of see more of the Delta. And hopefully by then the rain will have stopped a little bit and it won't be really, really hot yet. So anyway, hoping for a nice day. Anyway, I'm also available to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Are there any questions? Oh yes, Councilmember Burgess.
I love seeing this data, and I know that the last 5 years has been unprecedented is the word, isn't it? But I do think it's really interesting that all of these agencies are also getting to see it, so that they're going to kind of go back and reflect and kind of see what everyone else is doing. And I think that's really important. So this is a really interesting report. Thank you.
Amanda, I had a couple of questions, actually with Be It Long first. In the report, and because I did attend and did hear a lot of the feedback from those that were in the room, in the goals, if you will, one of them is obviously community participation. And so one of the questions that I had is, are we taking a look at maybe future forums and having those in the actual community, and maybe as part of maybe the task force working with a landowner or a farmer that could help bring in, if you will, some of their peers, so that we can augment that. And then coupled with the numbers that attended, and I thought that those numbers were phenomenal. It was over 100, almost 150, or if not more. Do we have the breakdown of public versus private in terms of who was in attendance?
Yeah, so to answer your first question first, our initial plan going into this was to do this first forum and then to do a second forum, much like the first. But given the numbers, given the mix of people who participated, we realized that we weren't catching the landowners, we weren't catching a lot of the EJ communities. There were a lot of people we weren't catching. And so we are really trying now to think very creatively about how we get into the communities, to meet with the landowners, meet with the RCDs, meet with the EJ representatives. And so we are going to do another forum type activity this year. We're not exactly sure what that looks like. And in fact, we're planning to discuss this at next week's restoration subcommittee meeting. But we're thinking of really changing it up even. Maybe we don't do a kind of a traditional forum, but we make sure, we go to the different coffee shops in the Delta, or we go to existing community meetings that are happening in Stockton or in Antioch or, Brentwood, and we meet people where they are. So we do want to make sure that we are connecting with kind of really everyone that we need to be connecting with and discussing this. And it goes beyond just the landowners. It really is the EJ communities as well, as you know. So anyway, so yes, but there are plans and we're still figuring out what's next, but it will not look like what we did on February 8th, although there is value in continuing to do that. And we do plan to do that again, probably next year. But yeah, more to come as we start figuring out what the next best step is.
Awesome.
And then your second question, which I didn't write down.
On the breakdown of participants.
Breakdown, yes. I don't have that in front of me, but yeah, we do have that information that I can definitely get and share with the council.
Perfect, thank you so much. With regard to the crosscut budget report, I can't tell you how many people from DPIC would say that was like one of the best things that DPIC has come up with, developed, and is of tremendous use for all of the agencies. So I think we should build on that, right? And I really, really appreciate all of the time, the effort, the energy, and the support that you have mustered up in trying to get us back up with DPIC and really making it, again, as effective of a forum that we can all walk away with, again, more clarity, if you will, more transparency, and definitely building on the relationships, I think is absolutely key. So again, kudos to you. I'm going to ask if there is any other questions from the council. And if not, Beck, is there any public comment?
There it goes. No, Madam Chair, there is not.
Okay. Thank you again, Amanda.
Thank you.
And Be It Long, thank you. We will now move on to the Executive Officer's report. And for that, we have our Executive Officer, Ms. Jessica Pearson.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a gorgeous day in the Delta, and my thanks to our hosts here at Bellevue Vineyard. I've got a few announcements today for my report. I am excited to announce that the State Water Board has named Jay Ziegler as the new Delta Water Master. Some of you may have worked with Jay or may know Jay, who has been involved in Delta issues for many years, and most recently he was the External Affairs and Policy Director for the Nature Conservancy. The Water Master administers water rights within the legal boundaries of the Delta and the Sassoon Marsh, and advises the State Water Board and the Council on related water rights, water quality, water operations issues, basically all things Delta and the watershed. So Jay is tentatively scheduled to provide his first update to us at the council, hopefully at our May meeting. We're working with him on that. So I'm excited to start that or renew that partnership with Jay. We've had a very successful partnership with our last Delta Water Master, and I really want to build on that. For covered actions, last month, I reported that on February 13th, the Department of Water Resources submitted a certification of consistency for the McCormick-Williamson Tract Levee Modification and Habitat Restoration Project, Phase B. The project's 30-day review period expired on March 15th without any appeals. A couple of comment letters this week. Actually, for those of you at the dais, there are copies in your green folder, and otherwise they are on our website. The first letter that we sent was to the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California regarding their Delta Smelt and Native Species Preservation Project. As you may recall, the Metropolitan Water District owns several islands now in the Delta. The project seeks to construct 2 marsh pond complexes that would house native fish for a pilot experimental study. Comments to Metropolitan outlined potentially applicable Delta Plan policies, including those related to best available science, ecosystem restoration, and Delta as place. The letter also invites Met to engage the council in early consultation before determining if the project is a covered action, and if so, that recommending that they submit a certification of consistency for that project. The second letter was to the Governor's Office of Emergency Services regarding the public review draft of the 2023 State Hazard Mitigation Plan. The Hazard Mitigation Plan details historical and current hazards, mitigation strategies and actions to address those hazards, and provides guidance to local jurisdictions that are developing their own local hazard mitigation plans. The council's letter advocates that the mitigation plan explicitly address the need to renew an expired MOU between the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and Cal OES for emergency flood fighting and repair in the Delta. And there's a copy of that MOU in your packet as well as an attachment to the letter. The third letter was to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers regarding their draft environmental impact statement for the Delta Conveyance Project. As a reminder, the Department of Water Resources is the lead agency for the Delta Conveyance Project, but for the purposes of the Federal National Environmental Policy Act and other federal requirements, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers does its own environmental assessment that has a separate set of rules. The letter to the Army Corps echoes our concerns that we raised in the January letter that council staff sent to DWR regarding the draft EIR for the conveyance project, but also highlights environmental justice, air quality, and public health concerns relevant to the Army Corps' analysis. We'll continue to provide updates on those projects as they develop. In personnel, I am excited to welcome Sarah Keck as our new Deputy Executive Officer for Administration. She's not here with us today, but she's watching from the office, and you'll hopefully meet her at our April meeting. Sarah comes to the council after 20 years of state service in administrative and financial roles. Most recently, she was the California Victims Compensation Board's Deputy Executive Officer of Administration, and before that, she served as the Cal EPA's Deputy Director of Administration, Finance, and IT for Cal Recycle. Sarah has a degree in business administration with a concentration in accounting from Cal State Sacramento. Also joining us at the council is Dr. Denise Colombano, joining in the Delta Science program, where she's going to be working on the Science Communication Synthesis and Decision Support Unit under the leadership of Dr. Maggie Chrisman. In this role, she'll be focusing on a variety of open science and synthesis initiatives, including working on our next edition of the State of Bay Delta Science. Denise is a 2-time Delta Science Fellow, which we're very proud of. And she received a PhD from UC Davis in 2019, working with Dr. Peter Moyle, studying native fish ecology and conservation. So join me in welcoming both Sarah and Denise to our team. As always, you have an outreach highlights report and an active projects list in your board packet. It's also available online. If you have any questions about those at any time during the month, let me know. And we don't have a legal update today, but we're going to make up for it with a jam-packed legislative update. Brandon missed our last meeting due to illness, and so we're happy to have him here today to report on the many legislative happenings related to the Delta. Welcome, Brandon.
Thanks, Jessica. And also I want to thank AGP for putting up this slides because I forgot to send it in before the meeting, so I appreciate it. What's that? Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Chairman Duane and members. Again, yeah, I apologize for missing last month's meeting, but I'm going to make up for it by filling in on everything that we missed last month. So if you can go to the next slide. One thing that I was going to provide, we mentioned the staff briefing a couple times that staff provided to the Assembly Water, Parks and Wildlife Committee. So just sharing a nice little picture there of Jessica, our Deputy Executive Officer for Science, Henry DeBay, and Dr. Laura Larson providing that briefing at the Water, Parks and Wildlife. Next slide. And as Chairman Duane mentioned, we've been hitting the road for the last 5 or so months now, hitting members of the Assembly, the Senate, and county supervisors. So just a list of everyone that we've met up to this point. I think we're relatively near the end of these meet and greets in terms of just a general get to know, but as there's new members or any new interest in the Delta or the council, we'll be happy to meet with any members that are interested. And I will point out, I know we don't have Contra Costa up there for the county supervisor, but that's because we have you on our dais, Supervisor Burgess. So, next slide, please. So the legislature's been very busy now over the last few months. There's been deadlines passed in terms of spot bills that need to become have information put into them and actually have stuff moving through the process. So quite a few bills to update you on. The first one is AB 1613. This is the what's been termed I thought I had the name of it there, but I don't. But anyway, this requires the Department of Water Resources to identify strategic locations in the Delta for salinity barriers, and then upon appropriation of the legislature to construct those barriers in the Delta. This is currently awaiting a hearing in the Assembly Water, Parks and Wildlife Committee, and we'll continue to monitor it, how it impacts both in the Delta Plan and the Delta, as well as how we can inform the bill as it goes forward. Next slide. Next, we have Senate Bill 586. This has to do with some flood management deadlines, particularly for Mossdale Tract and West Sacramento. It removes the exceptions for the requirements of Mossdale Tract and West Sacramento to achieve a 200-year flood protection by 2025, and instead removes any deadline to achieve that flood protection as long as the flood management agency does one of either 3 things: has an active federal project in the planning, design, construction, or project closeout phase, has a completed feasibility study awaiting congressional approval, or has an authorized federal project awaiting receipt of federal appropriation. So given our interest in the Delta Levy investment strategy and just Delta levies and flood protection in general, we'll be monitoring this as it goes through the process as well. And it's currently at the Senate Natural Resources Committee awaiting a hearing on actually next Tuesday, March 28th. Next slide, please. Next, we have Senate Bill 651. This is from Senator Grove. This is a bill that exempts from the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, and the Delta Reform Act any action taken by a state or local agency if the agency determines that the action is required to address drought, and also to accelerate approvals for projects that enhance the ability of that local agency to capture any high precipitation events for local storage or recharge. Obviously, given the impact of the Delta Reform Act that this would have, we are closely monitoring this bill, and I'll provide more updates as it goes through the process. This one does not currently have a hearing date as of yet. Next slide, please. The last of the bills that I'll highlight today is Senate Bill 687. This is from Senator Eggman. This deals with the Delta conveyance project. What this would do is essentially require that the Delta conveyance, any change in point of diversion hearings from the water board and approvals on that cannot take place until the water board adopts an update to the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan first and implements it. So kind of a 1-2 kind of steps in the process. This bill also has not currently been referred to committee, but I'll continue to provide updates on this as it relates to the conveyance project. Next slide. I lied. There is a few other bills I'm just going to highlight, but these are more general. Given the high precipitation events that we've had and flooding, there's a great interest in flood bonds, flood protection, climate change, and nature-based solutions bonds in the legislature right now. So there's currently 4 that we're tracking. There will be a lot of a dance to try to figure out how to combine these and ultimately have something that might end up going to the a general election for a vote as a bond. And we'll continue to keep you updated on that as well. But wanted to highlight these given the interest in flood protection funding that was brought up last month for the Delta Levy investment strategy. Next slide. Lastly, just a short budget update. The LAO recently, or actually this was in February, so this would have been in the last update, released its review of the governor's budget, and it included analysis of the flood funding that would be provided to the Delta. It recommends that that funding be approved regardless of any trade-offs that might happen with the budget. So it encourages the legislature to make those appropriations. But then the other thing that I've highlighted is that it specifically calls out the Delta Levy investment strategy as a good move to ensure that this funding is used well and towards the best purposes for state assets. So that's just highlighting that for your all FYI. And then I think that's the last slide. So I will go ahead and open it up to any questions on any of these bills or any of the bills in your packet.
Yes, Councilmember Burgess.
One that caught my eye was AB 1488, and I was just trying to understand it a little bit more. What the what it was. I was trying to understand what it was they were trying to do.
That's a good question. I should have brought my bill up here with me. Can you remind me what the bill is?
Yeah, it's California Environmental Quality Act, Water Conveyance or Storage Projects Judicial Review. And we can just talk about it later. I was just curious because I was trying to understand what was trying to be accomplished there.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely look into that, and I'll provide something offhand, and then also we'll provide an update at the next council meeting.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Any other questions?
Councilmember Zingali has his hand raised.
Oh, Councilmember Zingali.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon, for that. I actually just wanted to join Jessica in welcoming the new Water Master, Jay Ziegler, for a moment. Jay and I have known and worked together for, I think, 35 years, if I'm remembering correctly. We first worked together in the late 1980s on the acquisition of what was California's largest land trust at the time. And I just want to say he has a rare combination of dedication to public service, integrity, genuine interest in the facts, and an ability to build consensus among a diverse group of people. So I'm just thrilled that he'll be part of this work now and a partner to us going forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Councilmember Zingali. Yeah, I have not had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Ziegler yet, but I'm really excited to see us continue to build on the relationship that we used to have with our former Water Master. And based on what you just said, I think that we're going to have some great traction there. So thank you for those comments. Other questions? Brandon, great report, very thorough. And yes, we missed you at the last meeting, but you made up for it this meeting. So, so we're good. And yes, I'm very curious for you to come back and share with us after, I think it's next Tuesday's hearing.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it's going to be pretty significant. So yes.
Yeah, I'll provide updates on all 4 of those, and then as well AB 1488 at the next meeting, as well as anything else that pops up over the next month or so.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. As the last part of my report, I wanted to provide an update on our Delta Adapts Climate Adaptation Initiative, We've been making progress over the last few months in working with various stakeholder and technical advisory groups on the project. And so to provide this update, we have with us Dan Constable, our Environmental Program Manager. Welcome, Dan.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm going to give a quick update on Delta Adapts. As you may know, how's that? Yeah, I'm going to give a quick update on Delta Adapts, and we'll go back a little bit just to do a reminder because our last update was by Harriet Ross. That was back in November of last year, so I just want to give you a quick update on what we've done since then, what we're looking at right now, and what's going to be happening through this coming fall. So since our last meeting in November 2022, we reviewed some outreach at that meeting we had done at that time. That was with several groups, including members of what we call our focus groups, external agencies, parts of our 4 thematic groups, which cover agriculture, water supply reliability, ecosystem, and flood risk reduction, as well as feedback we've gotten from an environmental justice expert group, which is helping with a separate council project focused on the environmental justice issue paper, but many of the issues and their expertise are cross-cutting with Delta Adapts. So we wanted to give an update at that time as well. Today, I'm going to give an update of what we've been doing since that time, as well as the kind of view forward. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so here's a timeline of where we've been and kind of where we're going. So starting on the left, in fall 2021, we've been working on a series of outreach events. These have been both these focus groups that I referred to. We've had 4 of those over the last month or so, but we had further outreach before that. And this has been individual one-on-one calls with groups and partners that we've been working with, as well as smaller groups sometimes that we've been convening in that interim. On the agricultural front, that's included work with our partner, the California Department of Food and Agriculture. They've been kind of co-convening groups through that with our technical advisory group for agriculture. On ecosystem, this has included representatives from the Department of Water Resources, from the San Francisco Estuary Institute, recreational and restoration practitioners that have provided feedback, and others. On water supply, this is primarily the Department of Water Resources, again, on both water supply and water quality aspects and some of our modeling. And then again, on equity, it's been this environmental justice equity group, their expert group, which is convened of 4 groups that we work with, and they've been giving us really good advice. Since that time, kind of since fall 2021, we've actually been developing a series of what we call scenarios, and I'll speak about those a little bit more in a moment, but broadly, those are an illustrative approach of showing what adaptation could look like, one example on the landscape that helps us discuss trade-offs and compare different options. What we've been doing more recently is evaluating these scenarios, including with these focus groups, getting feedback at those times. We're going to carry that forward to a stakeholder work group, which is identified for May or likely early June of this coming year. And then over the spring and late spring and summer, we will be updating these and putting together what we refer to as an adaptation strategy. And we plan to bring that forward for public review this coming fall. And based on feedback on that, put that together into a more final version and wrap that up hopefully by the end of the year. And that adaptation strategy will really be the output of this phase of Delta Adapts. You can go to the next slide, please. So just a little bit more on what scenarios are. As it shows here on the slide, scenarios show an alternative ways to adapt on the landscape. And this is for all 4 of our thematic areas. They do not provide an answer of what should be done on the landscape. They provide a talking point, a starting point that we can discuss with stakeholders and partners and show what could happen. We expect that in the end, we will get additional feedback. We may change some of these, and the final outputs will not be reflective of what's in those scenarios, but they help inform what we put into what we call our adaptation strategies. These scenarios and adaptation strategies help us envision what could be on the landscape. And I do want to make a key point that the scenarios, again, they do not provide an answer, but they help inform the adaptation strategies. And those strategies are one level up. And so as an example of that, if you had a scenario that showed a particular land use, which we're not looking at parcel specific, it's kind of vague, the strategies are a higher level. So if you had a scenario that shows restoration in one area, continued ag in most of the delta, a scenario could be along the lines of subsidence areas, consider how to incentivize subsidence halting or subsidence reversal activities, whether that's growing rice, restoration, or something else. The last point on here is just that the different scenarios optimize for different delta goals. And so one of them is very focused on what you might refer to as the status quo, is pretty much preserving agriculture as it exists today, and certainly all agriculture on private land. A second scenario is focused on how could we achieve goals for restoration, targets for restoration that are identified in the Delta Plan and that have been enumerated as part of a recent update to Chapter 4 of the Delta Plan that you all are very familiar with. You voted back on June to adopt. We can go to the next slide, please. So our approach to developing these scenarios, we received quite a bit of feedback. This was from that outreach that we conducted on what should be in those. We tried to distill those down into a more generalized form that took the key takeaways from the feedback we got to put that on the landscape. Again, they're focused on meeting Delta goals. So one of those is preserving agriculture, our kind of Delta as place goal. The other is a little bit more focused on restoration. And then within these are other thematic areas. So water supply reliability, that's a more qualitative approach. Equity concerns, again, in Delta as place, and then flood risk reduction, which we'll speak about in a little bit more, is focused quite firmly on levees. For the ecosystem side, we looked at existing and planned projects, and we've given some recent updates to this, including what Amanda noted at the Restoration Forum, giving an update on what has been done on the landscape, and there's a really positive story there. A lot has been done. We looked at land ownership, trying to prioritize only looking at public lands first, and we recognize constraints. And one of the main constraints in the Delta is elevation, although there are others too. So if an area is zoned for future development or already is developed, you can't really do restoration there. Agriculture could continue if it's zoned for development, but it might eventually be developed. So that's something we always had in mind. And then a key focus across all the groups has been looking at subsidence halting or subsidence reversal. And so that is just the elephant in the room, that if we don't address subsidence, eventually something bad is going to happen. We have to keep the levees up. We have to bring that land up. You have to look at that as a key focus within the Delta. Next slide, please. So what we're moving into now is a kind of evaluation and trade-off of these scenarios. So we're identifying some of these trade-offs. We had some initial discussions with our focus groups, but we want to bring this forward to a stakeholder work group coming up in the spring. We're looking at these through our different thematic areas. So one is a flood model. This was developed by the council with some assistance, and it's part of the vulnerability assessment. We had done earlier work that helped identify where areas were more prone to flooding. There are some caveats here. It's just looking at levee overtopping. This is not the same as a FEMA flood model, but it does provide very useful insight looking at where some of the highest risks are and where we need to address adaptation to address those. We developed a levee costing tool. This with the help of a contractor as well. This is a way that takes an assumption of, okay, if an area may be subject to flooding or flood risk due to overtopping, say they're not quite high enough. We look at riverine inflows changing over time from climate change, as well as sea level rise, and ask the question of what is the geometry that needs to change, how much higher do they need to get, what are the underlying soils, and come up with a quite robust modular model that can estimate costs based on average cost per levee based on those geometry type increases. And that's a very nice tool because it tells you if you have a certain level of protection that you want in an area, it will tell you about how much that might cost. For on the agricultural side, we use the Delta Agricultural Production Model, which the council helped fund through UC Merced, so thank you for that. This is an open source model that was developed by Josue Medellin's lab that provides economic considerations and helps quantify some of the agricultural considerations. And then on the ecosystem side, we developed a tool that the council also helped fund through the San Francisco Estuary Institute, which provides metrics, acreages, different considerations for the landscape. And it has some nice modules built in that can help quantify, for example, how much greenhouse gas emissions would be avoided by changing to a different land use. Water quality modeling has been done through a series of water quality models. That work is going to be updated potentially a little bit, but it's primarily looking at salinity and salinity considerations. Next slide, please. So what all this is leading up to is development of our adaptation strategy. And these adaptation strategies, as I alluded to, are much higher level. They're individual strategies that support Delta goals and vulnerabilities that have been identified as part of the overall Delta Adapts project, really focused on making the Delta a more resilient system. They may be different based on geographic regions or other considerations. So one solution or strategy that works for the North Delta may not be appropriate for the Central Delta so soon, or South Delta, and we recognize that. Some of the strategies are not related to a specific scenario, and all that means is that we may have had an issue we identified under a scenario. We have a strategy that's higher level, that's disconnected from a specific geographic place. It's just something that needs to be done. We recognize that, and it's a little bit higher level. And then lastly, the implementing agencies, timeframes, and everything associated with this are going to be identified to some level, but at this point, we're still kind of working through that. Next slide, please. So what we're looking to as next steps, we have a stakeholder work group that we're looking at. It's likely going to be early June now. We have a date in mind, but no invites have been sent out. As soon as we firm that up, we will let the council know and send out to all our partners as well as our listserv. This stakeholder work group is going to be an opportunity to bring all the different thematic groups together. Any interested party who wants to attend is welcome to get feedback and come up with updated scenarios, as well as get feedback on potential strategies. We do intend to bring this to the council, so we will review the scenarios and trade-offs at a future date. Today I'm giving a very high-level update, but we do have a lot more specifics we want to discuss with you, including materials to provide you ahead of that. And then following that, we're going to put together a draft adaptation strategy that, again, we will share with you as well as the general public to get feedback on what that could look like. And then hopefully that will all come out in the fall, and we will be wrapping it up by the end of this year to provide an adaptation strategy, a first version of that can go out and provide guidance for the Delta. So if we go to the next slide, that is all I have for you today, and I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Dan. Questions of Dan? I actually have a couple, Dan, and thank you. This is very high level. I like high level. You know, we had a conversation last year when we were given a tour by the Met staff, and obviously the subsidence was a really big topic and adaptation was part of that. I guess my question is, how do you engage, recognizing that there's generational farmers out there, generational landowners out there? How do we embed them in these critical discussions? Because obviously they're going to be impacted. From an equity perspective and lens, I also take a look at the impacts that trickle down as a result of land being taken off the, if you will, off the production round. But how do we work in consultation with farmers? How do we work in consultation with those that their livelihoods are going to be affected? And you said something really critical, and that is taking a look at possible funds or a collaboration to be able to augment what they used to do as farming and now bring in new practices like rice farming and others. But how do we make that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. We don't have all the answers there, but it highlights a few points. One is that continued outreach and additional outreach is going to be really key. The agricultural group has been working with CDFA, as I mentioned, to help conduct some interviews, but there could be a lot more outreach. They've been able to reach some core, I shouldn't say core, but some landowners, but not all landowners by any means, and not some workers on the land that would also be impacted by any decision that's done there. Another part that you highlighted is the work that Met's been doing and some of these considerations around incentives. So we've heard from many different groups that rice does seem to be one of the solutions. It doesn't work everywhere. There are some trade-offs with water supply, salinity, flexibility and vulnerabilities during drought years in particular, and the economics around that. But one of the key parts we have heard from the feedback we have gotten is around rice and a mosaic approach. So not just saying there's going to be a whole swath of the Delta that's just rice or just restoration, but something that's more along the lines of what's been done in Staten Island, where there's a mosaic of different crop types that economically work out for them while also providing some habitat benefits. But we will be looking at more outreach following the stakeholder work group as well.
No, I think it's intriguing. When I first came on the council and I had a tour early on, to be able to meet with some of the farmers and to hear their stories of how they've actually changed their farming practices, obviously to adhere to better water conservation, but also changing the crops, the very crops that they used to farm generations ago, and now it's very different. And so if you take a look at obviously the community of Clarksburg, a lot of their land is now grapes and vineyards, and so there's a demand for that. Is that also part of these studies and taking a look at, obviously rice would be, it's in big demand, it's going to support the local economy. Do you take a look at all those factors as well?
There is a consideration of the economics. Yeah, ultimately we know that landowners are smart. They're going to make their own decisions. Economics is one of the big drivers there, but there are others as well. But yes, we are looking at the economic aspects of that, and the rice market may change in the future. We can't predict the future, obviously, but that's been one part of it that has been proposed.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other questions? Yes, Councilmember Burgess.
An observation. When we're talking about adaptation and we're in the middle of kind of a situation with these atmospheric rivers, the flooding and all of that, we're kind of in some of those scenarios, it seems. We had a presentation at the Contra Costa Board of Supervisors, and part of our county actually has been identified to have 500-year floods. And I'm kind of just thinking about what you're saying, and that category, it may change because it may not be that it's every 500 years or so. So it just, to me, as we discuss adaptation and we, I saw the extreme secondary climate stressors, and we have wildfire in there. I think about the smoke and the impacts that has on meteorology in the area and all of those. So adaptation is probably also accounting for things we don't know. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Burgess. Any other questions, comments? If not, is there any public comment on this item?
Actually, I was going to wrap my report
I'm
up
sorry.
and then maybe we can turn to public comment. Okay. Okay, thank you so much, Dan. I appreciate that. So unfortunately, we had to move today's agenda item 8, the presentation from the chair of the Delta Independent Science Board, Dr. Lisa Wanger. We hope to reschedule her for next month at our April 27th council meeting, which will be in Sacramento. As for today's agenda, after our lead scientist report, we'll hear from a panel of experts on the many uses and attributes and benefits and challenges of Sherman Island, the island that we are on. It's a Delta Island case study, if you will, and that panel will begin at approximately 11:30. So thanks for listening, and happy to take any questions and check for public comment.
Questions, comments? And actually, you beat me to the punch because I was going to put that number 8 was
Sorry.
actually taken out, but that's okay. We're good. Beck, is there any public comment?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay, moving right along. Thank you so much to Jessica and to all of the panel members today for all those great reports. Moving on to item number 7, and for that we have our lead scientist, Dr. Larson. Good morning.
Thank you. And if I could get the article visual put up, that would be fantastic. So I am going to start my article spotlight today with a question, which is very related to what you just heard about Delta Adapts. And that question is, how do we estimate which parts of coastal landscapes will be inundated with future sea level rise? One approach, which most coastal planners use, is you could think of it as a filling the sink approach. They have GIS information about elevations and basically draw higher and higher lines across that bathymetry, like filling a sink. Areas higher than the new sea level escape inundation or vice versa. But that approach actually gives us a worst case scenario for inundation because it discounts the fact that some types of ecosystems, like wetlands, actually can build elevation over time while sequestering organic carbon. I think you might hear a little bit about that in the Sherman Island presentation later. And if conditions are right, they can effectively keep up with sea level rise. So in this way, I like to think of wetlands as a tremendous battle partner to have in the fight against sea level rise. This is one reason why they factor so importantly into coastal resilience and adaptation plans like Delta Adapts or in the Bay Adapt. But like human battle partners, wetlands do have their limits, and they can only be pushed so far before they succumb to rising seas in this instance. Effective coastal adaptation planning then needs predictive tools that can help identify wetland management strategies to help ensure the long-term persistence of these really important battle partners. Now, the most common predictive models of wetland resilience simulate processes through which wetland soils are generated and lost, and some of those are shown in the upper right of the diagram. I don't know if you all have printouts of this in your packet. It looks a little small on the screen. But so they simulate these processes through which wetland soils are generated and lost, and they keep track of wetland elevations relative to the mean sea level. They're based on the idea that there's an optimum water depth at which wetland plants are happiest and most productive. And it's that, so if you're looking at the lower right there, it's that maximum that you see. So that's a plot of elevation relative to sea level versus the productivity or soil accretion rate of the wetland. And there's also a range of depths at which wetland plants can tolerate conditions. And so that productivity goes to 0 at an upper elevation and a lower elevation. When we say that plants are productive, what I mean is that they're rapidly producing organic matter in the form of stems, roots, and leaves. Plants do go through natural and seasonal cycles when they shed this material. And in forests, leaves and organic material on the forest floor are exposed to a lot of oxygen, which makes decomposition rapid and soil accumulation slow. But in wetlands that regularly have standing water, oxygen at that air-soil interface, or at that soil interface, is a lot more scarce, and decomposition is slower. So what this means is that that plant material tends to stick around longer in the form of highly organic wetland soil, which we refer to as peat in the delta. And this can accumulate at a rate much faster than in environments like forests with more oxygen. So to understand what happens when sea level changes, let's consider a wetland at equilibrium with sea level. And so in that plot on the lower right, that condition is the area in the green where that horizontal red line intersects that soil accumulation or that wetland productivity curve. So it's the point at which soil is accumulating at the same rate as sea level is rising. So if sea level rise were to suddenly decelerate, which is the opposite of what's happening now, if it were to decelerate, the wetland would be more exposed or at higher elevation, and the soil would be oxygenated more frequently, and plants would be less productive, which would result in slower soil accumulation. And that slower growth would make the relative elevation of the wetland, or its elevation relative to sea level, lower. And eventually it would come to an equilibrium again, this time at a higher elevation to match that lower level of sea level rise. So you could think of that as translating that red dashed horizontal line downward on that plot. And you'll see that it intersects the right side of the curve at higher elevations. But that's not what's happening. So here, in this case, sea level rise is accelerating. And under that condition, that red line translates upward. And what's happening with the plants is that, the plants become more productive. There's less oxygen at that soil-water interface. And soil accumulates faster, which allows the wetland to essentially catch up with sea level rise. But as you can see from this plot, that's true up to a point. When the wetland passes through that red point on the top, its maximum growth and soil accumulation rate, the horizontal dashed line, if it continued to move up, would lose contact with the curve. And what this means is that with future increases in sea level rise, the wetland can only slow down its soil accumulation processes. It's on the other side of that maximum. And as its elevation continues to decrease, it just produces organic matter or soil at a slower and slower rate. So essentially, it will eventually drown inevitably at that point. So that maximum on this plot separates wetlands into two regimes: resilient for wetlands that could keep up with sea level rise in the green, and unsustainable for wetlands that will inevitably drown in the red. So it could be thought of as a tipping point. Now, these processes are relatively easy to model in a computer model, and those models can be calibrated to individual wetlands that have different types of species and different characteristics of soil. The Delta Adapts product uses one such well-known model to estimate the vulnerability of delta wetlands to sea level rise, with the finding that all marshes will succumb to drowning under 6 feet of sea level rise in 100 years. This paper that I'm spotlighting, which is authored by Jim Morris of the University of South Carolina, who's one of the experts in these types of models, but also Judith Drexler of the USGS here in California, and Lydia Vaughn and April Robinson of the San Francisco Estuary Institute, improved upon that type of model and made it more specific to the Delta by calibrating it to more data sets from a wider range of sites around the Delta. So it's using more Delta-specific information. They also track new metrics like the amount of time that wetland will persist until it reaches the tipping point, at which time the wetland would become unsustainable. One other new feature of that model is that they looked at yet another factor that can lead to elevation gain, which is the deposition of sediment mobilized from watersheds by atmospheric rivers. So how many of you witnessed some erosion of the soil near where you live from the storms that we've just had?
Yes.
I know I've certainly seen a lot of that in the American River corridor. There isn't much data yet, but atmospheric rivers on whole are expected to erode more sediment from uplands and carry it to the bay and the delta where it can be deposited in wetlands. So that sediment in some cases might be just enough to boost a marsh in an unsustainable condition over that tipping point to the resilient state. So that process is included in this model, and the authors make some coarse assumptions about how much sediment might be deposited in a regime like this year with more frequent atmospheric rivers, and they tested what that might mean for wetlands. After all that explanation, what did they find? Well, the results weren't too different from what was found in Delta adapts, in that most wetlands would still drown in the Delta under 6 feet of centennial sea level rise, but they did find slightly higher areas of wetlands surviving, so it's a slightly rosier picture. And that was particularly true when atmospheric rivers became more frequent, with the percentage of marshes in the resilient state doubling when you have a lot of atmospheric rivers moving sediment around. They also tracked the tipping point, and they found that most wetlands reached a tipping point in just 41 or 66 years. That might be in the lifetime of some of our audience members here, depending on whether we're talking about 6 feet or 3 feet of sea level rise in a century. Now, the author's takeaway from these findings are that it's imperative not to wait to restore wetlands, as we lose that important partnership with wetlands that I discussed earlier once they pass through their tipping point. They also pointed out that models like this can help identify which wetlands in the Delta might be nearest the tipping point, and that's important because those wetlands might be effectively saved or pushed back into that resilient state by adding slurries of sediment to them to raise their elevations. This is an expensive intervention, but it is one that's done in the bay and something that can buy us time. So finally, the authors stress that these sobering statistics require planners to think in more than just one dimension, the vertical dimension, and actually identify places for wetland restoration where wetlands might be able to retreat laterally by moving inland to higher elevations. Because then, even though wetland area near the water is still being lost, you're replacing it with wetland area up gradient or at higher elevations. Because some wetlands already have these corridors for migration, the sobering findings of Delta adapts in this model might really be viewed as worst-case scenarios. Science articles like this illustrate just how important it is to think about wetland restoration in a coordinated and holistic manner that takes into account spatial considerations and a future elevation profile that might be very different from today. So I'll just say it's fantastic that we have the DPIC Restoration Subcommittee to take on these challenges, and articles like this are really relevant to that work. Any questions on the article spotlight before I go on? Yes.
You talk about species, and some, my question is, some marshes have more fresh water, others have more salt water, and there's kind of certain species that have kind of succeeded. As we see saltwater intrusion and salinity rise, does that impact the plants, and does that increase?
So I think I know what you're getting at. So yes, salinity intrusion does have a very noticeable shift on the species compositions within wetlands, and we do see an inland shift of salt-tolerant wetland species. Now, the general rule of thumb when you're talking about these tidal wetlands is that the more freshwater wetlands are the ones that tend to produce more organic matter and have more organic soils. They produce a lot more below ground matter in the form of roots that then gets preserved in the soils. And so this organic process of soil generation that I talked about is strongest really in the freshwater wetlands. But the flip side of this is that in the saltwater wetlands, those wetlands are really good at trapping sediment that's suspended in the water. And so you tend to get less organic soils. And there's a little bit of this feedback process that I described at play there, because there, when the wetlands are more productive, there's more stems that are more effective at trapping that sediment that's in the water column. So it actually works through similar processes.
But as we adapt, there may be a need to introduce some of these other plants into those areas as we see more salinity or saltwater intrusion.
So that's a really interesting question, and it's a question that's of great interest to researchers that work at the coastal margin. And actually in my own research group, I was asking similar questions, like on a species-specific level, which species are most effective at trapping sediment? If we want to build new land, do invasive species have the same function as non-invasive species? So I'd say that's a really active area of research right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Laura, I have a question too, a follow-up. So for some reason, I thought these atmospheric rivers, they're not new to California. The strength, the severity, and the, I guess, what we've experienced just in the last couple of months is a little unique, obviously. But how is that helping us with wetlands? And you said that the wetlands are, again, one of our best measures to fight sea level rise. But how is this stream of these atmospheric rivers impacting the wetlands? And is that going to also create another change, if you will, in terms of wetlands and its impact on sea level rise?
Yeah, great questions. And, I'll start by addressing one of the things that you started the question with, but wasn't part of your question, which is that atmospheric rivers aren't new to California. And that is true. We used to, like 10 years ago or so, we used to call them the Pineapple Express because a lot of them trace a track from Hawaii over to our shores. What is changing with atmospheric rivers is that they are becoming more, or the climate models project that they will become more frequent and also more intense, containing more moisture. And so we are looking at some changes associated with atmospheric rivers in this state. In this paper that I'm spotlighting, those atmospheric rivers provided net benefits to wetlands because if you look at like what makes a wetland keep up with sea level rise or not in a global way, a big driver of whether wetlands can keep up with sea level rise is how much sediment is available to actually be deposited on them that originated from elsewhere. And in the Delta, what we've seen with sediment is a gradual decline since the hydraulic mining era, as the sediments within the watershed that were mobilized through the highly invasive hydraulic mining have gradually tailed off. And so that's something that's, it's a concern for fish. Like many of our native fish species require turbid waters in order to evade predation, but it's also a concern for wetlands because having less sediment carried from other regions means that there's less available to support the vertical growth of wetlands. So atmospheric rivers could be helpful. They also could, one thing that hasn't been looked at is the extent to which they mobilize nutrients in the watershed, and that could be a double-edged sword because it could support productivity, but on the other side, too many nutrients can contribute to harmful algal blooms. So, we are interested in seeing more research on effects of these atmospheric rivers. But the other thing I'll mention is that These atmospheric rivers have connected new wetlands to the delta that are usually disconnected, particularly those in our bypasses. And that we know from over a decade of research now is a really good thing for supporting food webs and providing shelter and rearing areas for our native fish species.
Excellent.
Any other questions? Okay, I have some program activities that I'd like to cover, and I'll just say it's been a very busy month of workshops for staff in the Delta Science program. We kicked off the month with our 2-day integrated modeling framework meeting called One Delta, One Science, One Modeling Framework. The meeting kicked off with some visionary presentations from Cisco Werner, who's the Chief Science Advisor at NOAA. He works in Washington, D.C. But also Kristen White from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, who is the outgoing operations manager for the Central Valley Project, and Rayleigh Hood, who leads the Chesapeake Community Modeling Center. The presentations brought up ideas about incorporating human behavior into models and how important that is, quantifying uncertainty, and the concept of best available tools as a complement to best available science. A panel discussed these visionary aspects further and looked at how local agencies and investigators are dealing with decision-making under deep uncertainty, assimilating data into models, designing effective workflows that deal with big data, computational complexity, and the need to generate information quickly, and combining information from many different types of models of climate, water, ecosystems, and humans to address large-scale and difficult challenges. In the afternoon, participants identified what those grand challenge topics are that would be significantly advanced by more coordination around modeling and improved modeling tools. They ranked these topics with respect to their feasibility and their impact. And you can see some of the results on a figure that I put together and pinned to my Twitter profile, which is water/cycle, in case you're interested in seeing a preview of what those results look like. They're very interesting. For example, they highlight what is some of the lowest hanging fruit that could have a big impact on our ability to manage the Delta's resources with relatively limited investment of resources. And one of those topics that came out on top is envisioning alternative scenarios for managing salinity in the Delta and evaluating trade-offs associated with those, which is relevant to one of the bills that Brandon presented on today. So in the second day of the workshop, the participants got, I'd like to say, a little bit nerdier and addressed detailed elements of what goes into a common modeling framework in terms of the modeling tools, best practices, and governance of a modeling community. So for me, that session decisively addressed some questions I had about what this community wants and needs and provided important guidance on next steps. So what are those next steps? Well, subsets of the participants convened for an informal third day of the workshop and mapped out some strategies for developing research proposals that would advance the integrated modeling framework around the challenge of addressing some of those high impact, high feasibility challenges that were identified in the first day of the workshop. There are at least 2 external groups who attended the workshop that are developing proposals for external opportunities right now. Other subsets of participants convened to distill the workshop findings and lay out some directions for drafting a white paper that we eventually intend to circulate widely and present to the council and to DPIC, among other agencies and interagency groups. The white paper will contain a summary of the key findings from the workshop and produce recommendations of next steps for our science community. And I'll just say that this work is going to address a long-standing call from the Independent Science Board that's reflected in both the Delta Science Plan and the Science Action Agenda for the establishment of a modeling collaboratory. I'll say it took a village to pull off this workshop, and I'd like to extend particular thanks to Ben Guskey, Maggie Chrisman, Henry DeBay, who's over here, and Steve Culberson, along with all of the Delta Science Program staff who participated as session moderators or note takers. The workshop really wouldn't have been possible without all of them. And finally, we're working on posting slides and recordings from talks, and I'll stick a link to that in a future lead scientist report. I feel like I've been talking for ages, but I have another item, which is the IEP workshop. Now that we're nearly at the end of the month, the IEP workshop, which started on Tuesday, is happening as we speak. It's a hybrid event with the in-person component being held back in the CNRA building. I've been able to attend much of the workshop in virtual form and have heard some illuminating talks about the Delta Smelt Experimental Release Program, harmful algal blooms in the Delta, synthesis work conducted by IEP project work teams on food webs, wetlands, and plankton, ecological and water quality effects of the upgrade of the Sacramento Regional Sanitation District's wastewater treatment plant, and so many other topics. Today's topics are focusing on steelhead, sturgeon, fish diversity, Chinook salmon, and the role of predation in the Delta. In addition to the plenary talk and meeting organization by IEP lead scientist and Delta Science Program Manager Steve Culberson, the Delta Stewardship Council has contributed in diverse ways to this workshop. Dan Constable, and I think, is still here, and Dylan Chappell presented their synthesis work on ecosystem restoration in the Delta and Sassoon Marsh. Tricia Lee presented a talk on the development of a coordinated HABs monitoring strategy, which is one of the outcomes from our November 2022 workshop. Denise Colombano, who JP mentioned, is a new senior environmental scientist with the Delta Science Program, presented on the work that she did as a Delta Science Fellow on how zooplankton and forage fishes are responding to the altered seasonality associated with climate change. Lynn Takata and our former State Policy Fellow, Elisabeth Tate-Pulliam, moderated a lightning talk session, and then we also saw many talks from the investigators that we fund. Much of the workshop was and is being recorded, and a more detailed report with a link will be provided in a future lead scientist report. And then finally, on your radar, there are more great workshops in the works. First of all, the Delta Science Program has a long-standing collaboration with the UC Davis Coastal and Marine Sciences Institute, which takes the form of joint symposia on priority science topics. The next one is rapidly approaching on May 19th with the focus on understanding the implications of rising temperatures for coastal, marine, and estuarine ecosystems. And that symposium is going to feature 4 main sessions and have focuses on physical environments and how they influence biotic responses to heat waves, how organisms are responding, how communities and ecosystems are responding, and then management and governance, including the effects of heat wave events on economics and how heat wave events can be integrated into future plans. That symposium is going to be in person on the UC Davis campus, and it will also be live streamed and recorded, free and open to the public as well. And we'll soon disseminate a registration link on the council's listserv. And then it's not in your packet, but we also have dates for the upcoming Adaptive Management Forum, which, as I reported last month, is a meeting that we convene biennially. This year it's going to be held on May 4th and 5th with a focus on governance for adaptive management, with the aim of fostering learning and discussion around governance needs to support effective, equitable, and inclusive processes in the Delta. And I'll just say that adaptive management provides a structured approach for adaptation in the context of rapid, often unprecedented and unpredictable environmental change. And we note that its success depends on support from the larger social, regulatory, and institutional context, which we refer to as the governance system. So it's always fun to do the by the numbers stats now that we've whiplashed from these really dry conditions to super wet conditions. And the latest numbers are that if you're just talking about the amount of water and precipitation that different parts of California have received, the Northern Sierras received 135% of the average precipitation up to March 22nd yesterday, and the Central Sierra has received 185% of its typical precipitation for this time of year. If you look at how much water is currently stored in our snowpack, those percentages are even higher. In the Northern Sierra, the snowpack currently contains 182% of the water that is usually stored in snow at this time of year. And in the Central Sierra, we're at over twice the amount that's typical for March, at 227%. So that's huge. Things are also a little rosier than usual in terms of water temperature, which is a few degrees cooler at measurement points in Clear Creek, Collinsville, and the Clifton Court forebay. And then our reservoirs are doing really well now. You could say that we're out of our hydrological drought by looking at our reservoirs. The water in Shasta is at 99% of the average reservoir storage to March 22nd. Oroville's at 120%, and the San Luis Reservoir is at 110%. And of course, those areas are rapidly releasing water now in order to anticipate these melt from these really high water content snowpacks that we've got right now. And that's reflected in river flow. The Sacramento River at Freeport is running at 169% of its 20-year average for this time of year. And the San Joaquin River is at 316%, so over 3 times as much, conveying over 3 times as much water as is typical for March. And then the exports from the combined Central Valley Project and State Water Project diversion are at 189% of their 20-year average. So quite a reversal from last year at this time. With that, I am done talking.
Thank you, Laurel. Great report. Questions, comments? Yes, Councilmember Burgess.
As someone that lives in the Delta, it's just really interesting. The turbidity is very obvious when you look out. You can just see all the stuff in the water, and that's reflected in the data that you just shared. And what used to be really exciting was that snowpack number, but because things heat up, what used to be our natural water storage decreased because it's so warm, and we will not. So that's where we're having to do some adaptive management as well. And so it'll be interesting to see what we do. And hopefully things will stay a little cooler for a while, and that snowpack can be managed a little bit. Thank you.
Well, let us hope for a long, slow melt.
Any other questions, comments? If not, we will move on. Thank you again, Laurel. Great presentation as always, very informative. As mentioned earlier,
Chairman Dueño.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There's no public comment.
You read my mind. You read my mind. Moving on, since we have no public comment, as our executive officer mentioned, item 8, where we were going to have an update from the Delta Independent Science Board chair, unfortunately took ill, so we will hopefully hear from her at the next meeting, and we hope that she is feeling better and soon. So we will now move on to item number 9, which is the Sherman Island panel. And for that, we have our Deputy Executive Officer for Planning and Performance, Mr. Jeff Henderson, who will introduce our distinguished panel.
Thank you, Chairman Dueño. I'd like to invite our panelists to join me here at the table. And we should have Dan Welsh, Fran Stitcha, Randy Major, and Brian Brock. Brian is first. All right, thank you to our panelists, and we're looking forward to a great presentation. Just by way of background, we are here today on Sherman Island, which is a 10,000-acre island located here in the Western Delta, as Chairman Dueño mentioned, at the confluence of the 2 major river systems, the Sacramento and the San Joaquin. The island is largely owned by the Department of Water Resources. and managed by Reclamation District 341. Sherman Island is primarily used as pasture, but also supports some farming of corn, grains, and alfalfa. Its landscape is shaped by wetlands, marshes, riparian forests, and woodlands, and it features over 8,000 acres of conserved lands. This abundance of natural habitat makes Sherman Island a popular recreational destination that offers camping, fishing, and, as you'll hear, renowned windsurfing opportunities. Due to land subsidence, which we'll also be discussing today, Sherman Island now lies below sea level and faces significant flood risks. There are 19.5 miles of surrounding levees that protect State Highway 160, a variety of utility infrastructure, freshwater wetlands, and water quality in the Delta. For these reasons, and to help protect those assets, Sherman Island is categorized as a very high priority island under DLIS, or the Delta Levees Investment Strategy that we considered at our last meeting. Through the California Eco-Restore program, various habitat restoration projects have also been completed or are planned on the island and in nearby areas that provide added benefits to help reverse subsidence and decrease flood risk. So today we've gathered a panel that will present you with information about a variety of different activities on and around Sherman Island. And we've designed this to really intersect with the council's work. So we'll be discussing things as varied as subsidence reversal and carbon sequestration, the various different benefits associated with setback levees, one of which is constructed nearby, an experimental release of cultivated Delta smelt that also occurred nearby, and highlighting the various recreational boating and aquatic activities that are present here in the area. So really a good mixture of water supply, ecosystem restoration, and Delta place considerations. So I'm going to introduce our panelists today, and we'll be proceeding in the following order. With us today is Brian Brock, who is manager of the Delta Levees and Habitat Restoration Branch in the Division of Multi-Benefit Initiatives at the Department of Water Resources. Also Randy Major, who's a senior environmental scientist in the Delta Ecosystem Enhancement section in the Division of Multi-Benefit Initiatives at the Department of Water Resources. Dan Welsh, who's a deputy field supervisor in the Conservation, Restoration, and Contaminants program at the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. And Fran Stitcha, who is representing Bay Area Sea Kayakers. So I want to extend a welcome to our panelists and hand it over to Brian to get us started.
Good morning I guess it is on. And yeah, just in time. My name is Brian Brock. I'm with the Department of Water Resources, as Jeff indicated, and I'm the branch manager for the Delta Levees and Habitat Restoration Program. So if I can figure out how to forward this. Okay. Awesome. I'll say next slide. That's easiest. The Department of Water Resources purchased Sherman Island and Twitchell Islands. They were the majority of the acreages back in the early 90s for several different reasons. One was the development of X2, which is the 2,000 parts per million chloride requirement that the State Water Resources Control Board decision 1641 developed back in the 90s. The other was to improve levee infrastructure and maintenance and have a local role in the governance of both Sherman and Twitchell Islands. And then also the development of potential development for habitat. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. As you guys can see, as you all can see, the left-hand picture is the Delta, and the highlighted areas are Sherman and Twitchell Islands. And then the right-hand side picture, at least from my point of view, is what the elevations of the Delta Islands are, red being the lowest, and moving up the chain up to the green areas. As you'll notice, there are some areas on Sherman Island where we're sitting right now, which are extremely below sea level, probably about 10 to 15 feet below sea level. There are areas on Sherman Island that are less than 20 feet below sea level. So next slide, please. Why is Sherman Island important? We're right at the base of the Sassoon Marsh, where we have brackish water turn to fresh water further upstream. I like to say that this is the thumb on the hose or the cork in the bottle that keeps salinity from intruding further up into the delta. 8 miles is the 8 western delta islands, and you can see the salinity greatly decreases right there. Next slide, please. Here's a pretty good schematic picture in time of water quality. The left or the western edge is the Sassoon Marsh. You can see the gradient there of salinity is pretty impressive. And this is just this is a real-time photo taken from one of the websites that they have salinity measurements on. Next slide, please. So how did we get so low here in the Delta? The Delta was formed many thousand years ago when the sea level was out around the Farallon Islands. Levels were, sea level was 50, 60, 70 feet lower than it is today, and it's climbing, as we all know. During that time, tules were growing. The water would come from the mountains, the Sierra Nevadas, come down, and as sea level rose, so did the tules. Tules have a wonderful ability to grow on top of each other, and you would just get this incremental growth of organics and mixed with inorganics when the springtime floods would occur. And as sea level rise, the tules kept up, creating what we call peat materials. Now, what happened back in the 1800s was we would reclaim the individuals living at that time saw these islands as great opportunities to farm, homelands, marshy areas where they would drain the peat bogs, have very fertile soil, and grow some things. So over time, 1800s, they started reclaiming the islands, pumping them out, and then because of the dry conditions, oxic, aerobic conditions, microbes will actually eat the carbon in the soil, and the byproduct is CO2, which is a greenhouse gas, and basically the island would digest, the microbes would digest the carbon in the soil, degrading or lowering the levels of the on-island areas. And this is a schematic that shows that. And what are the consequences of this subsidence? Next slide, please. As you can see, it promotes levee failure. Back when everything was at sea level rise, there were no requirements for levees, and because of this difference in elevations, it really impacts levee stability. We get very high groundwater, very unstable area, and that picture in the bottom right is a tractor that is sunk down to very low levels. I've actually seen tractors disappear out here if they sink and they're left too long. Wow. Which I guess is one form of subsidence reversal, but we're gonna try to do something else, maybe more of a natural lands process. Next slide, please. So this is just a slide that shows ownership. The red is areas that the department does not own on both Sherman and Twitchell Islands. As Jeff was saying, we own about 80% or 90% of the Sherman Island and about 97% of Twitchell Island. So, but these are just areas where they're under private ownership. Next slide, please. So the natural process, growing tules, and there's been some research done since the late 90s, early 2000s, over on Twitchell Island, USGS, in cooperation with the Department of Water Resources. They first developed peat ponds, which are bathtubs, large doughboy bathtubs, and they filled them up with tules and watched them grow. And then that led to a larger scale 15-acre site on Twitchell Island, where we've been studying this for years, since the late 90s. These are pictures of what this, I call it proto-peat, the very beginnings of peat soils, and we had to clean one out maybe back in 2013 because it was stagnant and not growing anymore. There was literally 4 feet of this proto-peat out there. So yeah, tules do grow and obtain mass. Next slide, please. And these are the rates at which we found during those studies that they grow. Rather than going down, I don't know, somewhere between a half an inch to an inch per year. And it really depends on how much organic material is still in the soil. There's a lot of depleted peat here on Sherman and Twitchell Islands, so the amount that it's subsiding is less than what you might find on someplace like Bolden or another Staten Island where they have higher concentrations of peat. But rather than going down, you know, half an inch, maybe 2 inches per year, this peat growth does occur at about 2 inches per year. So, you know, we're at 20 feet below sea level, and the rivers are at 5-6 feet above sea level, and sea level rising. This isn't a short-term fix for sure. It's a long-term fix. Next slide, please. So the other benefits of growing peat, growing tules, is the ability to sequester greenhouse gases. So rather than the emissions, we talked about that byproduct of CO2 as a result of the biological digestion from the organisms eating the carbon, rather than having CO2 go up into the air in about 7 tons per acre. And again, it depends on how much carbon's in the soil. We start to sequester carbon, but we also have emissions of methane as well. So these are some different mechanisms that we use to measure them. On the left is a chamber type of measurement. We do that for nitrous oxide, which is a byproduct of adding fertilizer and things of that nature on farmland. And then the other schematic is a eddy covariance tower, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So rather than 7 tons per acre on average going up into the atmosphere, we're sequestering greenhouse gases. And there's an accounting system. So methane is a greenhouse gas that's about 25 to 30 times that of CO2, where nitrous oxide is about 300 times that of CO2. So when I say GHG, I'm talking about CO2 equivalent. So we're doing the accounting on that methane or nitrous oxide. Next slide, please. This is the close-up shot of an eddy covariance tower where we're measuring methane, CO2, water vapor, and it's all based on this LICOR data, a lot of post-processing. UC Berkeley, Dennis Baldacchi's group at UC Berkeley has been doing a lot of that for us. Next slide, please. Here is a model of the delta and emissions that potentially occur out of these, where green is not quite as high emissions, and the yellow is a little bit higher emission due to the carbon content. Next slide, please. So we talked about that accounting. So we have been measuring a wide array of different crop types. Corn on Twitchell Island and Staten Island and Bolden Island have emissions of about 8.5 tons per acre year of CO2 equivalent. And we did not consider nitrous oxide in this amount. So whereas on the bottom is pasture, it's got about 6.6%. And again, it really depends on how much carbon is in the what the carbon content of the soil are. Whereas a younger wetland has some emissions of about 1.7, but the older the wetland gets, the more it starts to sequester carbon, and we actually have about 1 ton per acre. So if you switch an older wetland from corn to wetlands, you'll have about a 9 to a 10 swing there. So next slide, please. With all of this data, we've developed mathematical models to predict And these are examples of mathematical models that are very highly, the R factor, how well it applies to the actual data. Our mathematical models are pretty darn good. So not everybody needs to put one of these eddy covariance towers. I should say that we've also developed a protocol with the American Carbon Registry where we can monetize these benefits. And we're also trying to work with the Air Resources Board to put that into the cap and trade program, regulatory program. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, Delta Conservancy, Campbell Ingram, and I re-upped a conversation with the Air Resources Board to try to move that forward. The difference is the amount of money that you end up getting for this. I think the regulatory program, which is the cap and trade program, is paying at about $15 to $17 per ton per year, whereas the voluntary market is more about $5 to $7 per ton per year. So, next slide, please. So what we're trying to do, I think what we're all trying to do in your Delta plan as well, is try to encourage the conversion from these crops that encourage subsidence, encourage greenhouse gas emissions, to something that's more sustainable, where a wetland trying to re-wet the soils. Next slide, please. Another way that we're doing this is we've been growing rice on Twitchell Island, about 600 acres, been studying the impacts of that on Twitchell Island since 2008, 2009. So positives and some negatives, but rice doesn't have the subsidence ability that the tules do. And it doesn't sequester as much carbon, but you don't have the impacts that you have that you would with corn or alfalfa or other crops. Next slide, please. So here's some projects that we've developed on Sherman Island. I guess I needed to bring my other glasses too, but Mayberry Farms, thank you. Mayberry Farms was the first one. It was installed or built in 2008, 2009. That's the one just a little bit on the northwest side of Sherman Island. Right below that is what I call Whale's Mouth, or what is called Whale's Mouth. That's a 650 acre wetland, and then one that was, and it was put in service in 2016. It was built over 2014, 2015, and put in service 2016. And then the one that you guys drove right past earlier today, which was constructed in 2019, 2021, and will be put in service this year, is what I call the belly wetland. And when I see Sherman Island, I kind of see a whale. I see lots of things in clouds as well. But if you see the tail up in the north, and it kind of looks like a whale. So anyway, next slide, please. Oh, yeah, Whale's Belly, or the belly wetland, as I call it, is about 1,000 acres. About 1,000 acres. This is a wetland on Twitchell Island called Twitchell East End project. It's 750 acres, but what's nice about this is you can see kind of how the levees are constructed, or the berms. We try to do it to maintain so that we have pretty good freeboard, and it's going to be in service for quite a while. So the berms are about, depending on where you're at, they're about 7 to 8 feet tall, 15 feet at the top, and about 45 feet at the bottom. So all of the material that we have used so far, none of it's been imported. We dig swales and then use that material, and lakes, use that material to build the berms, so that we have, and these areas, they have a difference in elevation. So we have tules growing about 2.5, 3 feet of water. So we have to terrace it, and that's what these berms are for. Next slide, please. And these are just some pretty pictures of different projects that we've constructed. This is Mayberry Wetlands. Next slide, please. This is a picture of, I believe, Twitchell East End project prior to flood up. Next slide, please. Here's what it looks like after it was flooded up and got a couple of years to grow. Next slide, please. Here's Whale's Mouth prior to flood up. Next slide. Here's a close-up of what it looks like after a few years to grow. Next slide, please. And there's another picture of what it looks like now. And next slide, please. This is what it looked like in 1969 when Sherman Island flooded. And it flooded, created a big scour pond right over by where Whale's Mouth is now. So, yeah, so I don't know what the format is, if you want questions or go through the presentations first. I apologize if I took too much time.
If it's the chair's pleasure, we could take questions now or hold for the end.
That might be helpful because I know I lose some stuff, so.
Yeah, let's take questions one at a time.
So let's take questions one by one, and I will start with Councilmember Burgess.
I'm enthusiastic. I always have something to say or ask. Sorry about that.
No,
So driving out here, see a lot of cattle. So my question is, does grazing do reverse subsidence, or is it or does it contribute to subsidence? And what about the carbon production on that?
Yeah, good question. Grazing actually contributes to subsidence, depending on where the water table is and everything, and how much carbon is in the soil. It depends on how much it will subside, but you know, that's one of the landscape management practices that contributes to both subsidence and greenhouse gas emissions.
And then on the rice, are these is the rice that we're experimenting with, is this a crop that has a value in the marketplace, or is this just some type of rice that is helpful to reverse subsidence?
Both, actually.
Okay.
So the types of rice we grow is a medium grain rice, Calmoche 102 and 204, I believe.
Oh, that one. Okay.
Yeah,
No,
if you know that.
I know I don't, but I just I'm teasing. But I'm just in general. Is this because to grow something, if there isn't a market for it, then it's great that it's effective at what we're trying to do, but to make it.
There is a market for it,
Okay.
and it's part of the global market, and it just depends on what the crop prices are that year. It fluctuates anywhere from, and it's by sack, which is 100-pound weight, anywhere from $13 per sack I've seen to $45 per sack.
So there is some motivation for folks to consider that. Are there any other crops that are comparable as far as being able to meet those two goals of something that's marketable and helps contribute to the goals that we're talking about?
Yeah. Well, carbon, if we can monetize carbon, that is one really good crop or one mechanism. Rice is one. Really what we're trying to do is put things underwater so it's not exposed to air during the warm months. And rice is one of those things. That's the main one. Staten Island has been converting a lot of their acreage over to rice because A, it's lucrative, and B, it helps with subsidence. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I too see things in clouds, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Burgess. Actually, Councilmember Burgess took, I think, my question, and I'll just kind of augment. So you say you have 600 acres of rice on Twitchell. What did you have on there before, or is just the brand new concept of planting rice to help with the subsidence?
Before 2008, it was mainly corn out there.
Okay, it was corn.
And after 2008, we let with a PSP to try to figure out how best to develop or reverse subsidence and sequester carbon. And it was a huge study, and it has taken off since then. So,
Do we have historical data, you know, going back to, I mean, like way back, and in consultation with tribes to see what other crops were being grown in this region?
Well, USDA does, and the local agencies, they do keep records of the different types of crops that are grown out here. Farmers register with them every year to decide that. How far back it goes, I don't know, but on Twitchell Island and Sherman Island, they've grown asparagus, they've grown tomatoes, they've grown all sorts of things over the years. But as the lands continue to subside, the ability to grow different things, it becomes less and less because of groundwater implications, salt implications, and other things of that nature. So cattle grazing really is kind of the last thing that you can grow if out here. So
Well, I eat plenty of rice, so bring it over, bring it over.
Virginia, I have a question.
Yes, Councilmember Lee.
Yeah, so I'm assuming it's not DWR employees that are doing the farming out on Twitchell Island, that you have leasees that do that work, farmers?
that's correct.
Yeah, so do you have any control over what they're doing? Are there agreements with the farmers? How does that all work? And are you able to kind of push them towards things that help with the subsidence issues, or can you explain that a little more?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the department does, through our department or our real estate branch, we do lease out the property to different leasees. To a certain extent, you know, we can control things like water. A couple of years ago, and last year specifically during the drought, we did have a water curtailment requirement. And we did limit different types of crops that could be grown. This year, we are saying none of our leasees can grow corn on their prop, just because of water consumption and the incompatibility with subsidence and carbon emissions. So, but if we want to build a wetland or something like that, all of our leases are currently under, I think, a year lease right now, so we would have to terminate. And you know, we want to be good partners, good landlords, so we try to give them as much time, as much warning as we can before we make some of these landscape changes.
Can I add on to
Absolutely.
that a little bit? Thank you. Yeah, I assume that part of the challenge is that those leases help pay for the levees, right? Levee maintenance, and is that true?
Indirectly, the state water contractors purchased the island for the reasons that I mentioned in my very first slide. So just the way the budgets work, when we get leased, I think that money has to go back. I don't, to some account, I don't know if it goes back to the general fund or how that actually works. But assessments are a large part of how the reclamation districts can do their work, along with the subventions programs, special projects programs. So indirectly, I would say yes, but directly, not necessarily.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I was just pointing out the tension between, you know, wanting to have, you know, productive farming practices on these state lands to help contribute to levee maintenance, et cetera, and for other benefits, but then also trying to figure out the right way to economically transition those to less subsidence causing practices. That's one of our challenges here.
It is a tight wire for sure.
Other questions, comments? If not, we'll move on to our next panel member. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you.
Okay, next up is Randy Major, also with the Department of Water Resources. Welcome, Randy.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Randy Major, Senior Environmental Scientist, Delta Levees Program. I was here about a year ago talking about generally the aquatic monitoring, so I'll be able to keep this fairly short. There's a few parts I'll go back over just for fun, but I'll emphasize what we've seen on the Sherman Island setback levy. Setback levies are kind of handy in terms of habitat for especially fish, but also other terrestrial animals and avian species. But it's a place for native plants, riparian plants to grow. It creates a softer environment for aquatic species and also gives some levee protection. But it's quite a difference between the riprap area and the bench that was created. If I could add the next slide, please. Oh, there we are. Okay, Delta Levees program, we work under a mandate, AB 360 in the water code. Basically, have to have net habitat improvement on the projects throughout the Delta. There's been a good $200 million spent on aquatic habitat from Decker Island, Dutch Slough Tidal Restoration Project, setback levees. And we've invested $23 million so far on 17,000 change of setback levees with waterside habitat. There's now currently $23 million being spent on 32 miles of levee rehabilitation that includes 3.5 miles of waterside levee habitat. And we currently have a PSP out, not for 60, it's $39 million for multi-benefit levees. So in general though, the levees are set back to deal with stability issues. It's expensive, it takes a lot of material. When you're moving a levee back on a floodplain, it's a lot easier. The levees can be smaller. You set it back on a subsided island, the levees are bigger, they're wider, you have stability issues with peat, so you have to build them. It takes a lot of material. And so the expense is something, but it's oftentimes necessary on some of these levees, and the RDs are working on doing that. And then when the levees move back, the remnant, we basically move the levee prism back, and so the older levee that's over on the channel is kind of a remnant, and you can excavate the material on the front then and bring the elevation down to intertidal, riparian, to some other kind of level, and that can act as a bench that is as close to channel margin habitat as we're going to get in the Delta. Oh, there we are. Okay, so the Mayberry Slough is in the orange. That is a high energy channel that connects between the San Joaquin and the Sacramento River. And then there is another one up onto the right corner there that hopefully will be start construction this year, maybe next year. A lot depends on permits. But those are the two setback, well, one's a setback levee now, and hopefully we'll get another one. And just to the right of the planned one is Chevron Point, and the Twitchell Island setback is just off the picture. But anyway, if we get the next slide. All right, this is the Sherman Island Mayberry Slough levee, the cross section there. It was actually built in two different phases. In 2004, 2005, 4,500 feet of setback levee were created for long-term levee stability. And then in 2007, an additional 3,500 feet of setback levee were built. And then in 2007, 2009, during that second phase, there was about 8 feet of elevation of the remnant levee taken off. And you can see that kind of in the dotted line off to the left of the cross section. That material was removed from the levee, placed, utilized for backfill and for the top of the levee, and then planted with native riparian vegetation. So it was mostly intertidal marsh and inundated tidally. The shelf was anywhere from 10 to 50 feet wide, depending on where. This is basically 1.5 miles of setback levee. This is the largest setback levee we have in the Delta right now. And one of the primary objective, of course, was to restore ecological processes and restore native plants, give fish a place to go. The secondary objective, which has worked quite well too, is utilizing the vegetation for erosion control to attenuate the high energy of Mayberry Slough. The water can rip through there, and the vegetation is very good at attenuating those forces. So it created about 3.74 acres of intertidal and marsh and riparian habitat. Okay, the next slide. This is a cross-section of the planned one. It's got a smaller bench. It's just the way that works. These levees, the setback levees, require a very large stability berm that's off on the right there. It's just kind of weighted because these levees actually kind of float on the peat. And so you have to make them quite wide so they don't tip or crack or anything else like that. Next slide. This is a conceptual model of the setback levee, but basically it's just to allow tidal waters to come up, interact with the soil, with plants, create phytoplankton, zooplankton. Fish can come in and graze, and your basic habitat, nice little habitat there. So if I can, next slide, please. Yeah, so the nice thing about this for our monitoring program is we have a number of habitats right adjacent to each other, right within the same area. You have a large area of the setback levee. Right next to it is your traditional riprap levee. We also have good reference sites either in Sherman Lake or at the county park there. And we also have open water. So in terms of monitoring, it's a great location. And we have been doing that now for 4 years. The first year was just a pilot project, just see if it'd work. But we've been using the platform that I showed you last year. I've got another picture of it, and eDNA data collection. We'll be continuing for another 2 years on this project, and then we'll see where we're at. Next slide. This is the aquatic habitat sampling platform. You've seen it before. It's kind of a nifty piece of equipment. It's a 22-foot pontoon boat with a forward-mounted fike net that can, during a transect, the fish come through an imaging box and out the back. And we record water quality parameters. We record what fish are going through, where. It's all geolocated. It can get into shallow water habitat. It can get into vegetated habitat. And it's all recorded for posterity. Next slide. We get a lot of data from here. Here's just the imaging box and pictures of the fish within the imaging box. We now have, Kramer Fish Sciences has developed some AI now that will identify the fish as they're going through. So some poor tech doesn't have to spend hours and hours watching slow motion video. Retention has gone up in that lab. So next slide. And we are also doing eDNA, environmental DNA. This is technology that's just been growing really fast. I think DWR actually is putting in a eDNA lab too in their water quality labs. But you basically collect a water sample, run it through a filter, collect the DNA, and then bring it back to the lab and run markers. And you can either look for a particular species, or you can look for who's out there. One is qPCR, which is looking for a specific fish, and the other one is metabarcoding, where you're just basically seeing who's in the neighborhood. And it's very effective. We've been using it with the platform just to try and correlate, because both of them are kind of new technologies. So we're just looking at both. And in Dutch Slough, I think I mentioned before, we're using a more traditional beach seine So just looking at all these technologies. Next slide. I covered this last year. We're just looking at a number of different sites trying to develop a model for what attributes of a levee we can create are best for the fish. And the really nice thing about the Mayberry Slough levee is that it has all the attributes that we're looking at, including terrestrial vegetation, which does not have an X down there. I'm not sure why. But anyway, next slide. This is just a map of showing some of the areas where we're working at. And again, Mayberry Slough is very useful in that it has all the habitats that are all the attributes that we're looking at. Next slide. Okay, so this is basically some of the preliminary results. I've updated a little bit. Our big data crunch and analysis won't really happen for another year and a half, just because we've got 2 more seasons to go, and it's going to require a lot of number crunching. The good news is we're collecting a lot of data. The bad news is we got a lot of data to go through. So, but basically, what we've seen, especially at Mayberry Slough, we get a lot more fish along the edge habitats than we are in the open water. And the riprap banks, a lot lower fish than non-riprap banks, like the setback levee. The vegetated habitat had a higher CPUE, that's more fish, than non-vegetated habitats. And the centrarchids, the non-natives, are most common along the riprap. So preliminary results are indicating that native fish use the setback levees a little bit more. I'm not going to publish that yet. We're going to get the numbers first, but it's looking like that. Next slide. This is just the metabar coding that we did. We identified 27 different species, and actually more than that now, 40. Salmon, very few, but we're not out there during the salmon season. Just permitting issues, we are still considered take, and so we can't get out there. We are going to be getting out there more with eDNA because you're just getting a water sample, and we feel very confident that what we see in the eDNA is replicated in what we can see by the transects in the boat. So during the periods where we can't get in with the boat, we're going to start collecting water samples. So next slide, please. And it's, again, the inland silversides are out there a lot. They're the most common non-native fish that we're finding. It's bothersome, but they're there. Tule perch, which was the native fish that we were able to find in good quantity during the seasons that we're out there, are higher in Mayberry Slough than at Twitchell, and higher than in any of the other sites. It's higher in they're higher in the setback levees, higher in the natural wetlands, and Mayberry actually even has higher tule perch along the riprap bank than any other site. So probably because we have Sherman Lake right nearby, which is a fairly natural habitat, all things considered. The results right now that we've got still somewhat confusing. I don't know if they'll clarify in a couple of years. We'll find out, and we'll report on that one when the time comes. But that's pretty much about it, I think. Next slide, unless there's something else. Oh, yeah, we're going to be continue collecting data, analyzing it, and hopefully develop a model so we can design better levees. And I think that's it. If I have any questions.
Thank you, Randy. Questions, comments? Yes, Councilmember Burgess.
Hello.
Hi.
So are the silversides, I don't really know anything about the silversides. Are they competing with the smelt? Is that kind of are they predatory?
They do eat smelt larvae, yes.
Okay.
They tend to be along the shallows, along the edge of the banks. We consider delta smelt pelagic, that they're more in the middle. I kind of wonder if they're in the middle because they've been pushed out of the edges, or they've always preferred it.
Okay.
Hadn't really been looking at them before inland silversides had come in. You know, they've been here for a few decades, so it's questionable.
And same with the various bass fish. They are predatory and native, basically, correct?
Correct.
And they tend to compete a lot with the salmon. I don't know everything, so I'm just
Right.
having you correct me.
No, you're
Okay.
right.
So it's interesting because, you know, I worked in Marsh Creek working on habitat restoration. And so it's totally different in the Delta, but there's some similarities. And one of the things that I've seen is that as humans, we've done these different things that, you know, kind of accommodated what we wanted to do, whether it's levees or flood control channels. And with the riprap, it could be very effective at keeping things from getting degraded, but it wasn't a very good habitat. And there's also a lot of value in creating capacity or protecting things. So I just, it's prettier too. And so I just wanted to are you seeing that the technology or the ways that we used to build levees, we're learning better ways to do it, I guess is the question I had.
Yeah, you're asking the biologist about that. Okay, with the engineer sitting next to me and my boss. You know, I think so. You know, there's a setback levee on Horseshoe Bend on Bethel Island, and I couldn't believe my ears when I was in a meeting and the engineers were saying, yeah, we're going to change the design on it because we want to put the bench and the vegetation on the area where the velocities are the highest because we can use the vegetation for erosion control. And I was sitting there just shaking my head going, wow, I've waited years for this. This is great to hear, you know. So yeah, we are seeing some changes, and creating a softer interface is definitely beneficial to any number of critters, especially the aquatic. And you're right, it is nicer. It's environmental aesthetics. It's driving along on a boat in the Delta, just seeing riprap kind of gets old.
Have we seen, have we seen nutria issues out in this area?
I don't think so, but.
Yeah, actually, there were, CDFW has a nutria eradication program, or a program. And out on Whale's Mouth, there were 8 that were trapped over the last, since last summer.
Wow, okay.
But I don't think that they've found, they don't know if that was just a colony that came in somehow with the flood waters, or, you know, or transported, you know, caught a ride on a jet ski or a boat or whatever, but.
They've been known to like those jet skis, I've heard.
But they haven't found them anywhere else yet.
Okay.
And they do have quite an array of field cameras out there taking a look. With respect to the levee issue, you know, it's a matter of cost, because the vegetated levees take up, you need to provide for potential issues that arise, and riprap is pretty known. But if you have a tree fall down or something, you know, and takes part of the levee with you, you know, so the Army Corps of Engineers and the Central Valley Flood Control Board, they want to see a levee out there. But if it's not part of the levee, you know, per se, and there's a very defined prism within that levee, you can do other things, and that's part of what Randy was talking about, is setting this levee back,
right,
and not using the actual prism levee to do all of these things. But it takes a lot of material, yeah, because we've got a huge subsided area. So not only do you have to bring it back up, but you have to bring it back up to a standard.
And I know we're learning as we go, always, but one of the things that I've observed in the flood control channels, and I know this is different, but what we've learned is that infrastructure that we've built 50 years ago is degrading, and now we're having to go back to these kind of more natural ways. Do you foresee this actually being using the vegetation and all of that as actually more cost effective possibly in the future?
Yeah, we've created an artificial system out here for sure. And subsidence is a huge part of that. And using natural systems to build that back up is a very cost-effective way of doing that, rather than, you know, somehow bringing a conveyor belt from the Montezuma Hills and filling up these areas. Yeah, we can use plants to do that. So with respect to levees, it's a more expensive way to do it, but in the long run, is it more sustainable and better for the environment and better for humanity and all living things eventually? Probably.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? If not, we'll
Madam
move on.
Chair, if I
Yes,
could, I just
absolutely.
wanted to provide just a little bit of context for the members with relation to kind of how setback levies are addressed in the Delta Plan. And just as a reminder, one of our regulatory policies requires that a levy project that's a covered action evaluate alternatives to what I'll paraphrase as traditional approaches. One of those options is a setback levy. And so when a levy project that's a covered action comes forward, one of the Delta Plan requirements is that that project consider alternatives to the traditional construction, including a setback levy. And in fact, if it's determined to be feasible, to implement that strategy. So that's sort of the interplay between what the Delta Plan considers with regard to these setback levies and, you know, this choice between a more natural alternative and a more traditional alternative. That's the interplay.
And I'd just like to add, we have a PSP that's out right now, and all of our projects give weight towards these multi-benefits. So we are really encouraging that natural type of process as well.
Okay. Thank you again. Moving right along. Next panel member.
We'll have Dan Welsh with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Hi, it's an honor to be here today to, excuse me, to talk to you and give you an overview of the success of the first 2 years of the Delta Smelt Experimental Release Program and to discuss future plans. Have the next slide, please. The purpose of this slide is to orient you a little bit to the Delta Smelt, its life cycle, and where it occurs in the Delta at different stages of its life cycle. The Delta Smelt are a small fish native to the Delta. The upper right is a photograph of an adult. The adults spawn in freshwater areas of the Delta, and the juveniles move downstream into what's called the low salinity zone, and live and mature in that zone. So kind of right in the middle of this circle of Delta Smelt life is Sherman Island. Sherman Island is and the waters around it are very important areas for Delta Smelt, particularly for the juveniles as they're rearing in that low salinity zone. And I would also, for background, the Delta Smelt life cycle is only a single year. The adults don't live to a second or third year. They spawn and basically die. So every year is important for Delta Smelt. They've got to get it right. And a bad year can be extremely bad for the population. And we've had a number of bad years. The Delta Smelt population, a fish that was once one of the most abundant fish in the Delta, has declined to the point where it's nearly extinct, and we seldom catch wild Delta Smelt anymore in the regular monitoring programs in the Delta. Their numbers are extremely low. Next slide, please. Because of that low population number, a lot of thought has been given as to how do you restore the Delta smelt. One approach, certainly not the only approach, but perhaps a necessary one, is supplementation of the wild population with releases of captive reared Delta smelt. We're fortunate that there are captive Delta smelt being reared by UC Davis, their Fish Conservation and Culture Laboratory, and they've been doing this for a number of years and are able to reproduce Delta smelt in the wild, and so I'm not in the wild, in captivity, and maintain a refugial population, and also fish that are available for scientific work. So we've embarked on a 3-year project to explore questions surrounding supplementation of Delta smelt. We're not at the supplementation stage yet. This is more of a pilot study, an experimental stage, where our primary goals are to learn about the logistics of being able to feasibly release cultured fish into the wild. Logistics in terms of their propagation, the tagging of the fish, the transport, and the release. And we're looking at different tagging strategies as well that'll help us with the interpretation of the data when fish are recaptured in monitoring programs. And before I move on, I want to say that this is definitely a multi-agency effort. It's not just the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service doing this. We're partnering with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Water Resources, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and the U.S. Geological Survey, and last but not least, of course, the University of California at Davis. Together, these 6 agencies comprise the experimental release technical team. May I have the next slide, please? Okay, so we're in year 2 of a 3-year project. I want to go over both year 1 and 2 as far as what we accomplished. The year 1 releases began in mid-December of 2021 and lasted into mid-February of 2022. We released fish at 3 different locations, including the Sacramento Deepwater Ship Channel, the area around Rio Vista, and then a 3rd location in Sassoon Marsh. We used 2 different techniques for release in year 1. Those are called hard release and soft release. I'm going to show you some pictures that illustrate what those are. Most of the fish in year 1 were released via the hard release technique. The total number of fish released was 55,733 fish in year 1. Next slide, please. Okay, so the hard release technique involves transporting the fish from the rearing facility in containers called carboys. These are these cylinders that you see on the deck of the boat in the left-hand slide. Each carboy holds about 200 fish. So you transport the fish from the rearing facility, load them onto boats, use a hoist to lower each carboy overboard and release the fish into the water at that time so they can swim freely into the water. Whereas, next slide. The soft release technique gives the fish a little time to acclimate to the water by holding them in a floating cage for several days before opening it up and letting the fish swim out into the river. So 2 different techniques that were used in the first year. Okay, next slide. We didn't stand up a separate monitoring program for this effort, but there is a lot of monitoring already underway and permitted in the Delta, and we're able to rely on those existing monitoring programs to recapture fish. This slide shows the release locations as well as the locations where fish were recaptured. And it's very encouraging. We recaptured 78 Delta smelt over a 4 to 5 month period, meaning those fish were surviving for, some of them were surviving for quite a while out in the Delta and surviving into the breeding season. So we think this is very promising. It indicates that the fish survive when released via these techniques, and that they disperse from the release sites into other areas of the Delta. Next. All right, so I said we're in year 2 now. We've completed the releases, but monitoring is going on. We didn't have quite as many fish to release in year 2. Only 43,705 fish were released. We reduced the number of locations where fish were released to 2, Rio Vista and the Sacramento Deepwater Ship Channel. The Suisun Marsh site is quite a bit further from the rearing facility, and this has been a challenging year with the weather conditions and whatnot, so we scaled it back to 2 release sites that didn't involve transporting the fish for as far. First releases took place in late November of 2022, and the final releases were in late January. We used 3 different release methods this time. The hard release and soft release methods were both used again, and then we experimented with another technique, which I will have a later slide showing you, but that's the trailer release, transporting the fish in a fish trailer, which has advantages in that it will hold more fish and more efficient in terms of the labor involved. Okay, ma'am, the next slide. Another improvement in the study in year 2 was developments in how we tag the fish. The first year we were only able to tag the fish with 2 methods, so it was harder to evaluate the different release locations and dates, whereas this year we have 6 different marking methods. 5 of those involve what are called VIE tags, or visible implanted elastomer tags that are different colors. We used blue, green, red, and orange, and they can be put on either the left side or the right side. And also a technique that involves clipping the adipose fin of the fish, which is a pretty standard technique with hatchery releases of fish, including the salmon, and it doesn't really hurt the fish or impair its ability to swim or survive in the wild. So with the expanded number of tagging methods, we're able to evaluate the data better. And next slide, please. I promised you a picture of the trailer release, and this is showing this. It's just a lot more efficient to be able to transport 3,000 fish in a trailer directly from the rearing facility to a launching ramp and let them go there. Then all of the handling and lifting and hoisting of the carboys with 200 fish each. So we're hoping to be able to utilize this technique better in the future. Next slide. All right, year 2 monitoring is in progress, but we've already caught around a little over 40 Delta smelt, and monitoring continues year round, but fish from this release effort probably continue to be caught for several more months. What's encouraging here from year 2 is that we've recaptured fish from all release types, so from the hard release, soft release, and the trailer release, indicating that they're, regardless of which method you're using, they are surviving. Another encouraging point is that the monitoring has captured 5 unmarked fish this year. Those would be wild fish, whereas last year it was only 1. This may mean that some of the fish we released last year reproduced and helped contribute to an increase in the population, but that could be wishful thinking too. But either way, there's an increase in the number of unmarked fish that were captured. Not a huge number, but at least it's in the right direction. So far, the longest period between release and recapture has been 47 days, which is indicating good survival and dispersal of these fish. All right, moving on to the next slide, please. So there are a couple of key takeaways from this experiment. As I said, we're testing methods, we're testing the logistics of maybe a future supplementation program. But what we're finding is that the fish indeed do survive the transport and release and disperse around the delta. We think reproduction in the wild is likely. And clearly, larger scale solutions are needed if we're really going to make a difference to increase the size of the Delta smelt population in the wild. We're going to need to scale this effort up a lot to release a lot more fish. Next slide. And this next slide will be my final slide. What's next for 2023, 2024, which will be year 3 of the experimental release program. It's intended to be the final year. So as I said, we plan to explore larger scale release techniques. Our current methods relying on carboy transport of 200 fish per container are not manageable for much more than the number of fish we had in year 1 and year 2. We really need to explore large capacity transport options such as the trailer method that I showed. We're looking to gradually increase production of captive reared smelt and their availability for release, moving toward a supplementation target of 125,000 fish per year, but not all in one big jump. I mean, the first and second year we were in the 40 to 50,000 range. Next year we'll be targeting release of about 75,000 fish. And then beyond that, the intent is that a more structured actual supplementation program with the larger numbers of fish will be built into the agreements on what is required for funding from the Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of Water Resources through the consultation that's ongoing on the long-term operations of the state and federal water projects. That'll give this program a lot more sustainability and stability at a larger scale. Currently, we pulled this together with the other 5 agencies using existing staff and equipment and funding, and it's very promising. It makes sense to look at scaling it up and a more sustainable structure and funding process for that. And that's it. I'd really be happy to entertain any questions if you have any, if we have time.
Thanks, Dan. I think we have.
I think we're running a little short on time, but I do have a quick question for you. So given the map you showed that shows the smelt, life cycle and their reach, why are they being released also down in Clifton Court? Is that simply for study purposes to look at predation and study those patterns?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, and I'll clarify. The rearing facility is down near Clifton Court. That's where the UC Davis FCCL lab is located. We're not releasing fish there. The fish have been released in the locations at the Deepwater Ship Channel, Rio Vista, and Suisun Marsh.
Okay. Other questions?
Yes, and I know but I just want to make a point. If you hold up your phone and you go diagonally, that's about 6 inches, and so that would be 2 delta smelt would fit across there. I just want people to, or across. I just want to kind of give people an idea. And so then when I'm looking at the adipose fin being clipped, or is it like a injection to put the little dyes in for all these? And so there's people that are doing these things, correct?
That's correct. The fish are individually marked at the FCCL lab, and that is another aspect of the project that is labor intensive.
Right.
Trained individuals need to handle those fish and either inject them with the elastomer tag or clip the fin. They get really good at it and fast, but we are looking at other techniques that would be.
But there's so little that
and there are some techniques we want to look at that would need to be started in a laboratory setting to see if they work and how the fish handle it. But there are methods involving dye. So a lot of fish can be marked at one time in a water bath with dye. Things like that would increase the efficiency of this project.
And what is the cost of this? I was thinking, is there a possibility of making this something that could be something that's done locally that could create local jobs that could be of a value for these local communities?
Yeah, because of the way that the first 2 years have been pulled together with 6 agencies contributing their existing staff and equipment, not hiring people for it. I don't really know what the cost has been, although we'll be pulling that together and looking at it. But to really do the full-scale supplementation over the years that it would take, that's going to be expensive. Most of the people doing the work are, they are part of the community. They're people that live in the local towns and cities, working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Lodi and Cal Fish and Wildlife in Stockton. So there's already some of that. I don't know anything specific about an economic opportunity.
It's just something I was thinking about because it doesn't seem like it's going to be something that's going to be solved over the next few years, and so it might be something. And it just reminds me, you were calling it supplementation. When I worked in Marsh Creek, we talked about bringing salmon into the creek, and I always called it artificial insemination. So I just had to share that.
I like that.
Other questions? If not, we'll move on to our next presenter. Thank you very much, Dan.
All right, Fran Stitcha with Bay Area Sea Kayakers.
Well, guess what? This is going to be a lot shorter and a lot less technical. Hopefully you'll have fun. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to provide some information and hopefully some inspiration. The personal background that I bring to you today is that Bay Area Sea Kayakers, BASK, is a larger sort of Bay-oriented organization, but I have a list of other organizations that I researched, if anyone was interested, you know, meetup groups, just clubs, et cetera, but just to give you an idea of user groups around, and I didn't hear back from 2 different groups. I am a former sea kayak instructor and a trip leader, and my claim to fame for you is that I kayaked from Martinez to Stockton. Took about 3 days, but it was fun, challenging. Next slide, please. So the, in addition to the Delta Plan from 2013 in Chapter 5, which does reference recreation, I just wanted to give you the foundation for some of my thinking regarding recreation in the Delta, and those are the documents. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I mean, they're online and they're available. Okay. Next slide, please. This particular slide just gives you a little idea about the Delta in general as a destination for paddling. And again, I'm really going to be focusing on human-powered craft when I talk about different things today, not motorized vehicles. There's a whole nother club and organization and legislative effort around that. I'm not part of that, okay? So I just have a curiosity for the folks that I'm speaking to. How many of you consider yourself water people? Yes, all right. Okay, and by that I do mean people that have perhaps gone out on the water that are not using motorized craft, okay? Right, good, that's where we're at. For all of us that do that, it's there's an expression called OTW, on the water. And I'm only sitting on this point right now today because when you're on the water, you're out there with the fish and the birds and the quiet, and you're not on land. We are on land now, and we are human beings, and we walk around on land, and we live on land, but when we're on the water, it's a different experience. So that's really where I'm coming from when I talk about human-powered craft. And part of what you're going to hear me talk about in the next few slides is about water access. The key word is access, ACCESS, or that interface between water and land, okay? Next slide, please. So who are we? Next slide. Thank you. These are some examples of human-powered craft users, again, not motorized craft, such as power boats or jet skis. So maybe some of these are in your experience. Some of these craft are used singly, such as sea or fishing kayaks, sculling shells. Others are in multiples or in groups, such as whalers, dragon boats, double sea kayaks, sculling shells that have multiple people, 2s, 4s, 8s. Next slide, please. And what are we doing out there? We're getting out on that water, as I mentioned, to experience other creatures and to hopefully not get sunburned. And again, these activities can be done sometimes singly or in a team. Boat club activities are multiples of these. There are people getting out on these types of craft and they're having competitions. And at one time I was asked to explain what does it mean smoothing out some edges. I can give you an example from my personal life. During the first 2 years of the pandemic, when things were pretty tough, as you all know, some of my paddle friends said, let's just go. So we went out one day a week. And I can't tell you that feeling of being out there on the water, just away from the tension, right? We had each other's backs because that's what you do when you're in human-powered craft. You have to watch out for your people. But that's what that means. I've also led groups in after-work paddles. So sometimes you had a day and you go out, okay? I also got a quote from Keith Miller, who's the owner of California Canoe and Kayak, and he observed a jump in sales of fishing kayaks in the first 2 years of the pandemic. Okay, next slide, please. So where are we going and how are we doing this? Okay, so the access points are the ticket here. This is the hard part. And the key sentence is anywhere that a human-powered craft can legally and safely go in and out of the water. So if you are a user, you understand. You bring your craft to that interface place wherever you are, and then you're getting into the water. So next slide, please. Since we are on Sherman Island today, and that was supposed to be the focal point of my talk, I need to make it very clear that I think in your staff report it said Sherman Island is an internationally known windsurfing area. The island is also open for fishing, camping, picnicking, kayaking, and kiteboarding. So in that southwest corner there, you know, the wind is just, well, today it's going crazy, right? But I do not windsurf, so I can't speak to that experience, but that wind does become an impediment, say for kayakers or canoers, all right? But we're still talking recreation. So that's what we're talking about. Next slide, please. I also wanted to find out how we are getting onto the water in sense of what's the mechanism that you're using. So here we have again, personal ownership or boating clubs. For example, there are dragon boat clubs that are out there that have, you know, people that come together weekly to practice or to compete. There are yacht clubs and marinas that have storage structures on their docks, and they're renting spaces for people to come, and so that the person doesn't have to transport their vehicle back and forth from wherever they live. They can leave it at a particular place. There are training clinics. In fact, the trip that I made to Stockton was to escort 2 small sailboat people. I mean, the kayakers weren't, but the sailboat people were taking a boat to Stockton for one of the gentleman's kids' training on sailing. So that's why we made the trip. So I also gave you a list of a variety of different outfitters who are running trips or doing sales of boats. Their websites are there. So that's a sample. You can check those out on your own. Next slide, please. The other thing that I'd like to bring to your attention is that human-powered craft users may not be residents of the Delta, or they may, but what they do is they bring some economic contributions. And so the listing is on your slide thing there. Again, I mentioned the outfitters, and I've noted in my explorations of different access sites that many places do have fees for parking. They have fees for launching. I'm saying this because another person and I went to a lot of access points and just started to collect data. And one fellow that we met at BI in Bethel Island was saying, "Oh, you're a kayaker. We'll just charge you for parking. Just go, you know." In Martinez, which is closer to the water where I live, there's a huge parking lot and there's a regular boat ramp, and we're not charged anything. So the access is right there. So I'm just giving you some examples. And then there are private marinas where you can't get in. So that's that. The other thing that has been brought up in the past is the idea of a water trail here in the Delta, which means that you paddle from place to place, and that in the evening you stay at a campground or maybe a hotel, or, you know, if you know some of the facilities that exist in the Delta, there are these options for places to stay. Some of them are more welcoming than others. Again, I've learned this from my own research. But, you know, again, if you're paying to stay at a place, it's an economic contribution. And the last one is the most important one. We are not using gasoline to power our craft. We are powering it ourselves. We need fuel, and that is food. All right. So the good news is that if anybody has food trucks, cafes, restaurants, markets, bars, there you have it, right? The idea of having post-competition victory parties or potlucks, again, you know, where are you going to do that? Who's going to provide the food? All right, next slide, please. The challenges that human-powered craft people face are listed. These are just some of them. And I will say that the limited number of access points is an issue. I don't know how to say this to you. I mean, there is the San Francisco Bay Water Trail, and I really do encourage you to look at their website, because there's an explanation for how people can get on and off the water. That could be replicated here in the Delta, but right now the distances are bigger. So that's why that item at the beginning is first. The third one about increased distances from craft drop-offs to launch sites. You can have a parking lot, and then you have your put-in, you know, which is far away. Big Break is an example. So you either have to have some sort of, either you're heavy, you can carry your thing, your craft, or you have wheels, but the closer you can get to a point where you can drive up and drop it off and then go off and park, that's, you know, that's where is most desirable. The third one is unfortunately happening. I experienced it when we were doing that trip from Martinez to Stockton. You know, when you're a human-powered craft, sometimes it's a game of chicken, and how close can we get? The other issue is let's speed up so we can make wake and make them fall over. So those are just, you know, I don't know. It's a reality. Restroom facilities. The other thing that when you have a boat ramp that's a concrete boat ramp, a corrugated boat ramp, if they're not well maintained, algae grows on them, so that when you come up, when you want to launch your whatever you're launching, you can slide off and then hit the concrete. So that's not a good idea. So it's a good idea when they're maintained to not have the algae on them. Same thing with high docks. If I'm in a watercraft and I'm sitting down on the water level, the way I'm going to get in is I'll just get into my craft or step onto my stand-up paddleboard or whatever. But to get out, you have to push up, right? If the dock is not well maintained, you get lots of splinters in your hands. Or if there are no cleats to hang on to, sometimes you can pull yourself out. These are just the practicalities of human-powered craft, but I'm pointing them out to you because the environment out there is everything from soup to nuts, right? And probably the one other challenge that we face is just the changes in the seasons and the extreme wind in the summertime. So that's it. Next slide, please. And there's a lot of websites that I use for collecting data, but also for you, so that you can become more informed about the recreation people. And I would definitely like to give you a shout out to the Department of Boating and Waterways Facility Finder. It is a terrific website, has resources listed, and just go in there and play around with it. The second one, I'd like to give you a little bit of a recommendation here, is the Bay Area Sea Kayakers website. There's something called a trip planner, and it is an interactive map. You can do research for a trip by looking at tidal information. There's a tab for weather. There's a way for you to gauge distances with pins. It's a very rich tool, and some of the access points in the Delta are on the trip planner, but the more that we have, we can feed the data back into the fellow who developed this, and he'll just put them on the trip planner. So I really want to encourage you to look at that. The remaining slides, I'm not going to talk, and maybe you can just enjoy them because they're pictures of places in the Delta that are taken by a lady named Kathy Bunton, who's owner of Delta Kayak Adventures, and she's an outfitter. But, you know, you can just enjoy the pictures. So I don't know where my picture people are, but they can keep scrolling slides. Okay, all right. Okay, I'm done. So do you have any questions?
Thank you so much, Fran. Questions, Councilmember Burgess?
East Bay Regional Park District, when I was on that board, we worked to make our parks accessible. A lot of the things you were talking about is still in the works. And it also made me think of Tom Torlickson's efforts to make the Delta accessible by bicycle too.
Right.
And, you know, so many people are looking for unique experiences, and coming out to the Delta, whether it's kayaking or paddleboarding or kite surfing or bicycling, fishing, there are all kinds of amazing things to do that are healthy and interesting. Thanks.
Absolutely. Other questions, comments?
I did put together that list, as I said. I don't know how to give you the information, but I brought a few copies, but I recognized that I could just email it to our fearless staff person, and you guys could get it later. But it's a summary of some of the organizations. There's many meetup groups which do declare how many members they have. Now, are they out there every weekend? No, they're not. But it's telling you a little bit about the level of interest of people who want to get together with other folks, which is a good safety practice. So
Yeah, no, to your point, we just got an article, or a clip of an article, where the Delta Conservancy just allocated $2.5 million to Stockton for a Stockton Aquatic Center, which is going to bring in, you know, all of these organizations that have been trying. I know I met with them years ago when I was with Boating and Waterways, but it's also to create a public access point, a better public access point in the city of Stockton to the Delta, to provide, again, equitable recreation access points to the Delta for, you know, again, communities throughout Stockton. So I thought that was, that's a step in the right direction. It's obviously just for the planning project. They obviously need construction money, but I have faith.
Yep.
They'll achieve it.
Yep.
And to the other point, as I was driving here, I was supposed to bring the train, but that's another story. There was I've seen a couple of them, one on 5 and one, I think it was on 160. It says entering the Delta, you know, and they're faded. The signs are faded, you know, to the state of California, whoever is in charge of signage, but they really don't do a good pictorial, if you will. If I'm from outside of the area, from outside of California, and I see that entering the Delta, okay. If they had, you know, a billboard, you know, entering the Delta, and you show, again, people kayaking, people camping, people wine drinking. Did I say people wine drinking? But again,
you know, the National Heritage Area, the NHA is,
yes,
it's in its incipient phases, and it's, I think they're addressing that.
Yeah, tremendous opportunities. And again, I just commend your enthusiasm and support of the Delta and what you do. And I actually live 2 blocks away from the Stanislaus River. And so I do go out there, but I just, you know, wade my feet in the summertime and take my dogs. But I think that there is just so much to be said when you are out in nature, when you are out in the water. And again, that's why we're here, right? We're here to celebrate and promote. And yes, the pandemic did teach us a lot about what we are missing out on. So again, appreciate it, and turn it back over to Jeff to close us out.
Just want to say thank you to all of our panelists.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you to each and every one of you. Beck, yes. Beck, do we have any public comment on this item?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay, then. We are now going on to our next item, and it's actually preparation for our next council meeting. The next council meeting will take place April 27th, 28th at the CNRA building, the Natural Resources Building at 715 P Street. And again, please refer to the posted meeting notice 10 days before the meeting for further information. And I'm supposed to announce that we're going to have a walk, the levee walk behind the building at some point. Okay.
Yep, just very casually. There's a gravel pathway that goes around the side of the building, and it'll lead you up to the top of the levee, and it's a lovely view if you just want to.
Self-led.
Yes, self-led.
Self-led. Okay.
Not an official part of the meeting.
Wonderful. And with that, we will adjourn this meeting. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Daniel. Food, yes, Judge. Let's go eat.